A video covering the life of Leon Degrelle has been by far one of the most common video requests I've gotten for essentially an entire year now, yet I always had to keep putting it off due to a lack of sources in English. Luckily for me, however, I now have some help in the less accessible periods of his life. For Degrelle's pre-war years, a friend has kindly translated and summarised foreign language biographies that otherwise would have been completely unavailable to me, and for that I can't thank him enough, as this video would otherwise not be possible. On the other end of the timetable, we have Degrelle's exile, and that task was much simpler, as Antelope Hill Publishing kindly offered me a copy of their book on the topic, Leon Degrelle in Exile, 1945 to 1994. So a big thank you to them as well, and I can't recommend their website enough. They've helped me out with a ton of videos now, and many of you have already checked their site out, but if you're new and you haven't already given them a look, then I really suggest you do so, as they have a gigantic variety on there by now. I do also have a code for their site, which will give you 5% off on any purchase you make there, which is ZoomerHistorian5, case sensitive, thank you. Also, before we begin, I must give the usual disclaimer. This video is purely a work of history, and not even remotely political in any way, shape, or form, so I urge you to please not overthink it and come to any strange conclusions, thank you. And lastly, a huge thank you to my Patreon, Subscribestar, and YouTube members who make these videos possible. Without their kind support, I quite simply would not be able to make these videos for a living like I do now, and for that, I cannot thank them enough for their endless support. So if you'd like to support the channel, join our Discord, or our weekly Paradox games, then please do consider signing up in one of the links in the description. Thank you. Even the $2 tier helps more than you can imagine. Degrelle was born in 1906 in Bouillon, a city in southern Wallonia, right on the border with France. For those of you who aren't European, or perhaps don't know much about Belgium, it's probably worth me pointing out the obvious. The country, one of Western Europe's youngest, is split into two. In the north you have the Flemish, a Dutch-aligned people, who then, as now, have an extremely strong independence movement, and many of them scoff at the very mention of the name Belgium. In the south you have the Wallonians, a French people who have been the dominant force in Belgian history. An example of this would be how Brussels, a Flemish city for all of its history, quickly became completely and utterly Frenchified. The religion of both regions is Roman Catholicism, and that's what led to the two very different people ending up together in the first place. All of this is, of course, relevant to the story of Degrelle. Degrelle was the son of a brewer, and his family was a typically middle-class one. As a boy, Degrelle barely had to leave his village, and it was a rather typical, quiet, and rural place to grow up. Education was extremely important for the young man, as well as his Catholic faith. Things wouldn't be quite so smooth, however, if we consider the year Degrelle was born, 1906. 8 years later, of course, Europe was tearing itself to pieces, and Belgium was right at the forefront. The Degrelle family initially fled to Sedan in France, but this too was taken by the Germans, and so they just went home instead. It was here that Leon first saw dead bodies, and this left quite the impression. His father would make beer for the Germans and win their trust, yet behind the scenes, any information he gained from this trust was given back to the French. Eventually, after 4 long years, that conflict came to an end, and none other than Philippe Pétain, the Lion of Verdun, came to visit Bouillon. Degrelle would later claim that he snuck past the French soldiers and shook Pétain's hand. Life wasn't all sunshine and rainbows with the war over, however, as Degrelle would be bullied at school for his father's supposed collaboration. He was also literally beaten by his teachers into being ambidextrous because he was left-handed as a child. Belgium, too, was far from peaceful at this time. In fact, it was very volatile. Flemish nationalism, socialism, and communism were all on the rise after the Great War, and the latter two were becoming endemic in industrial Wallonia. The people had gained the right to vote after the war, and now the Socialists were the second biggest party in the country, only a little behind the Catholic Party. At the age of 13, Leon cycled all the way to Trier in Germany, the furthest he had ever been from home before. In order to get there, he had to get past a hill, which he called the End. It was here that he discovered that the world, quote, goes further than Bouillon, end quote, and he became determined to see the rest of Europe and the world. The young Degrelle also did a lot of reading around this time too, especially French novels. In 1921, he left for Namur to study Greek and Latin at a Jesuit-run school. The level of discipline required here was a lot to bear for Degrelle, and he found it extremely hard to conform to the high standards of the Jesuits. A classmate who went on to become mayor of Bouillon described Degrelle as an average student who had a very hard time with discipline, and as someone who struggled learning for courses he did not like. At this time, Degrelle hoped to become a priest. In 1922, at the age of 16, Degrelle wrote some short stories and poems, and the theme was generally rather sad, and he was having a tough time with puberty and felt a little lost. Despite his cocky attitude, he was fairly well respected by his classmates though, and got on with them well enough, often helping sick classmates by taking notes for them. It was also around this time that Degrelle became enamoured by Charles Maurras and the Action Française just across the border. Maurras quickly became Degrelle's political influence, whereas Cardinal Mercier, who was a little closer to home, would be his spiritual one. In 1924-25, Degrelle would study literature and philosophy at university in Namur. On one occasion, he pushed for Maurras to win the Best French Writer of the Last 25 Years prize, and he actually ended up winning, much to the very Catholic school's distaste. Degrelle also joined the Catholic Youth Association of Belgium, or the ACJB. This Catholic apolitical action group practically had the entirety of the French-speaking Catholic press in their hands, and they would almost unanimously like Mussolini and Maurras. Degrelle would later use these vital connections in his political career. In July 1925, Degrelle would be expelled from college after he gets into an unarmed conflict with his philosophy professor. Giving up on his previous dreams, he chose to follow in his father's footsteps and moves to Leuven, where he studies politics and law. Leuven was a fine example of Belgium's lack of stability. Leuven University was almost entirely French-speaking, despite being in Flanders, and so, rather understandably, the Flemish students were far from happy. These Flemings had organised themselves into student unions based on the German model, and the Wallonian students had done the same but on the French model. Fights were frequent between the two, and even the odd murder happened here and there. Degrelle, however, got his head down and studied day and night, yet to no avail. He would eventually leave university without a degree. He did, however, take over a student magazine during this time here, and he used it to spread radical ideas, which had by now, over the years, formed the basis of his political thought. Léon would end up crossing paths with Flemish nationalists during this time, and he even attended meetings of the radical Flemish nationalist student unions, who proposed a total split of Belgium and the unification of Flanders with the Netherlands. This isn't to say that Degrelle endorsed such ideas, however. In 1928, Léon's life would take a dramatic turn as events in Mexico unfolded. A Catholic student had murdered the Mexican president, and his cause was supported by Catholics all over Europe. The ACJB decided to send someone to work as a correspondent, and that man was none other than Degrelle. To get into the country by boat, he required fake papers, as he had publicly written about the Mexican government before. However, he managed to get there, and he saw the destruction that the anti-Catholic government forces had wrought. Upon his return, Léon led a bohemian life and put all his money into a possible literary career. His apartment was apparently absolutely filthy, with dirty underwear and other such filth all over the floor, and he collected so many books that he had to start storing them in the ACJB office. It was during this time that Monsieur Picard, a patron of the ACJB, decided to give Degrelle a leading role in a publishing house, going by the name of Rex, which was currently down on its luck. Léon quickly turned the company around and published some pamphlets. Two were anti-German and even pro-American, and another was about the poor neighbourhoods in Leuven. These were received well by the Belgian Catholic elite, and he even received a signed thank you note from the Belgian Prime Minister, Henri Gaspard. In 1931, Degrelle was made director of Rex, and the company now began to shift from Catholic pedagogy into politics and news. Rex was the press chapter of the ACJB. In that same year, Léon convinced the patrons of Rex to help him found a magazine, like Time in America, but with a Catholic focus. Degrelle also began to write for Soris around this time, and the cartoonist there was none other than Hergé, the father of Tintin. Later on, there was a myth that Degrelle was the inspiration for the Tintin character, but this is a total fabrication, as Hergé had begun drawing the cartoon in the late 20s, well before Degrelle made his name. On the 10th of October 1931, the first edition rolled off the printer and was an immediate success among the French Catholic middle classes. Degrelle, who was full of himself beforehand anyway, now only grew in confidence. The ACJB, however, began to grow threatened by Degrelle's success with Rex, and they attempted to sideline it. Degrelle kept winning, however, and in March 1932, he married Marie-Paule Lemay, the daughter of a bigwig industrialist. They honeymooned around the Mediterranean at locations such as Switzerland, Napoli, Capri, Malta, and Carthage. Léon's new in-laws became incredibly helpful when it came to money lending for his projects. Whilst away, however, the ACJB made their move and removed Degrelle as the main editor of Rex. However, by now, Degrelle had things under control and set about changing Rex from a publishing house into a party. A magazine soon appeared, the only professional literary magazine in the country for a time, simply named Rex, founded by Degrelle. Inside were lots of articles on books and essays, very intellectual and political. Degrelle would often write political polemics inside against all the main parties in the country. The Catholic Party sought to use Léon's influence, however, and paid him to pump out Catholic propaganda, which he did. One of these propaganda pieces was a drawing of a gas mask, in the form of a skull, which just said, "Stop the invasion, vote Catholic." The drawing, however, was just straight up stolen from a booklet by Herge, the Tintin man. Quite rightly, the cartoonist was furious and threatened lawsuits, but Degrelle simply refused to give in and claimed that the drawing was property of Rex, and then he began to spread libel against Herge. Eventually, however, there was an attempted reconciliation via a third party, but Herge didn't trust it as the third party was a patron of Rex. The relationship between the two men was spoiled for good. However, Herge did get his Rex money for the drawing after a lot of pressure. There was more trouble for Degrelle too. The ACJB forbid Rex to publish political opinions, and so Degrelle started yet another new magazine, this one called Vlan, in which he slandered various politicians in Belgium. The Catholic Party was especially singled out, yet the party remained the biggest in the country. These types of magazines began to worry the Catholic Church, but the French-speaking youth loved them, so they were in a bit of a bind. Vlan, however, never really caught on, and so another magazine was started by Degrelle, named Croix, in which he talked about Catholicism especially. Thanks to these endless magazine ventures, Rex publishing house was now losing money, and Degrelle was in debt to the tune of 74,000 Belgian francs. There was trouble at home too, as Degrelle's daughter, Françoise, died at only 5 months old in May 1933. The girl's mother, understandably, was extremely depressed, and so she went back to her hometown. Degrelle, meanwhile, remained, and he rose at 4 am every day in order to get to Mass at 5 before taking the 9 am train to Leuven to go to work. With Rex nearing bankruptcy, Degrelle used his in-laws' money to buy Rex, and so it now became independent of the ACJB. Degrelle was now the owner, with some wealthy backers from Catholic monasteries and capitalist circles. The ACJB themselves even chose to support Rex with money, but soon enough, in December, they gave Léon a choice. He would need to choose between their money or politics, and so he chose the latter, and then began to slander them in his paper. Rex's first independently published books were received well, but they were inherently flawed, as many of them were full of weird mistakes. The money made from the books weren't enough to build Rex up to be an actual political factor either, and so Degrelle organised meetings with an entry fee to raise funds. These were rather popular with the French-speaking youth, and in them, Degrelle would attack pretty much anything and everything, from Germany to socialism to the Catholic Church hierarchy. A Degrelle quote from this time was, quote, "If people want to pay money to go and see some idiot on screen, they should certainly want to pay to see me," end quote. Overall, Degrelle certainly had a gift for speaking, and it was from this strategy that things began to change. Even still, he needed time, as Rex was still almost bankrupt by December 1934, and on New Year's Eve they had to leave their office building. Degrelle had to go and flirt with the ACJB and the prominent Catholics, and then beg for money in order to keep things afloat. Degrelle, as soon as he had his money, then went around the country breaking up Catholic meetings, supposedly in the name of Catholicism, and his own meetings continued to be successful. The mainstream Catholics tried reeling in Degrelle, yet to no avail. Rex had become a serious force within Catholic French-speaking cultural life, and they wanted to reform the Catholic Party. These events culminated in the so-called coup of Kortrijk on the 2nd of November 1935. On that day, the Congress of Catholic Circles took place with the Catholic Party, various youth movements, newspapers, and such in attendance, including Rex. Degrelle, in beer hall putsch fashion, interrupted the meeting and began a speech railing against the Catholic leadership and the Catholic Party. He ended his speech by telling his men to leave the meeting, and in practice, the Catholic movement. Public opinion on this move was 50-50, and Rex didn't completely split from the mainstream as they still walked with other groups to a World War I memorial service. However, they began shouting slogans during their silent memorial, which certainly didn't win them any admirers. Catholic movements all across the country began speaking out against Degrelle and Rex, who were seen as a radical and reckless youth movement. Cardinal Van Ruy, a gigantic name in the church in Belgium, said that Rexism was a betrayal of Catholic values, and good Catholics were banned from attending Rex meetings. Most Catholics would have heeded Van Ruy's call. However, many youths felt betrayed by the Catholic Party and their old guard, who they deemed to be rather archaic. These young men joined Rex, and most of them were middle to upper middle class types. In November of 1935, Rex became an official party. On the 4th of December 1935, Rex, the party, held its first meeting in La Louvois. The meeting, however, ended in violence as communists turned up looking for a fight, and party militants and police had to forcibly remove Degrelle from the hall for his own safety. Regardless, Degrelle was now the youngest party leader in the nation's history, a record that wouldn't be broken until Tom van Grieken took the reins of Vlaams Belang in 2014. With the help of some industrialists and his in-laws, Degrelle was able to fund some campaigns and compete in elections. Somehow, he had to come up with 300 people to put on an electoral list, as well as 600 replacements, which simply wasn't a possible task. One of the biggest problems was that Degrelle had no support in Flanders, at least among the Flemish. Some of the very small French-speaking minority would, but that was about it. Degrelle could not speak Dutch, and he only ever embarrassed himself when he tried to make speeches in that language, as he would write down the speeches beforehand and then practice them intensely, rather than actually learning the language. Most of Degrelle's politicians and electoral candidates came from small far-right Wallonian parties, and the parties themselves were quickly swallowed up by Rex. Wallonia, when it came to radicalism, was extremely left-wing, and the space was dominated by socialists and communists. So Degrelle was truly breaking new ground here, and also fighting an uphill battle. Degrelle would make alliances with smaller middle-class bourgeois parties around this time, and later he would claim that these alliances helped him gain 200,000 new members, which simply wasn't the case at all, and a gigantic over-exaggeration. Regardless, he was making some friends. There was some trouble, but soon enough Rex developed itself into the party for the middle class, much like the NSDAP in Germany. In 1936, the cabinet made up by Prime Minister Paul van Zeeland fell due to an unstable coalition. On the 16th of April, the election campaign began without Rex even really having a party programme. It was just Degrelle who was the glue. Apart from that, Rex had some vague points that could be interpreted very broadly, but that was about it. Rex agitated aggressively against other parties, but not so much against capitalism, only what Degrelle called banksters, which effectively meant the 1%, or super capitalists. Compared to the PNF in Italy or the NSDAP in Germany, their stance was less aggressive on this topic, and this would have been a little hard anyway, given that Degrelle's in-laws were capitalists, and most of his money came from big business. One part of the Rex programme that was clear was his ethics, and these were Catholic ethics. No abortion, and strong family principles of course being at the top of the list. Rex also wanted to give parents an extra vote per child. To appeal to the lower classes, there was a few points that would have given benefits to the average worker, but it wasn't anything too crazy. Degrelle saw industrialisation as efficient and good, but thought that there had to be better protection for the workers and their rights. He was never fully on board with corporatism, and did support unions. Before the big election, Degrelle also founded yet another newspaper called Le Pays Réel, which was the official propaganda paper of Rex. It was very successful, and most buyers were from the Wallonian middle classes. Due to time crunches, however, the paper was extremely sloppy and essentially just whipped up and thrown out onto the shelves without a second thought, and as a result, they were full of language mistakes and even outright lies. Rex actually ended up winning big in the national elections and secured 21 seats in the Chamber of Representatives, which meant 271,481 votes in total, or 11.49% of the vote, the fourth biggest party in the country, just shy of the number 3 spot. 12 seats were also gained in the Senate. Rex was the big winner in Wallonia in the south, whereas in the north, in Flanders, the VNV doubled its seats. The communists tripled nationally too. Some of Degrelle's methods were a little underhanded, as he just slandered his opponents to death in endless scandals, but regardless, they worked. He called his behaviour the Great Clean-Up, a slogan which he stole from Verdenaso, a lowlands unification movement which had begun as Flemish nationalists. After Rex's success, opposition immediately mounted. The major socialist and Catholic papers began to smear him, and the Flemish realised that Degrelle certainly did not have their interests in mind. The VNV paper stated, quote, "He, the Wallonian, is for Belgian unity. He is for the military power, in bed with France. He doesn't want to give any national freedom to the Flemish. Who is on these Rexist electoral lists? Francophiles and pure reactionaries." End quote. In Belgium, traditionally, the king invites the winning parties to come and talk with him, and despite the opposition, Leon was invited and duly attended on the 28th of May. Here, Degrelle stated categorically that he was pro-democracy and anti-fascist, and he, at least according to himself later, refused a leading role in the government that the king offered him personally. It does, however, seem extremely unlikely that the king, who is by law meant to be apolitical, would give the leader of the fourth biggest party a leading role in such a government, especially one who was widely viewed as an extremist. Regardless though, in the end, Paul van Zeeland just ended up forming another government. In Parliament initially, Rex came off as a bit of a joke, and after their first political act in Parliament, they were simply laughed away. One of their key attributes, however, was calling out corruption, so despite their amateurish appearance, they did have their heart in the right place in some areas. Outside of Parliament, Degrelle found the time to build up the party, as well as the party's ideas. Every village had to have a chapter and a strong core. Even Rex Flanders was built up under the leadership of Paul de Mont. Degrelle, however, was of course the main man, and the party itself was basically entirely focused around him and his charisma. Degrelle knew this as well as anyone, and the party press really stressed the cult of personality. The paper's sales did begin to plummet, however, and this was a big hit, as before they could have been very important for collecting party funds. In order to collect some of his lost revenue, a bank account called Battle Fund Léon Degrelle was opened, which party members and supporters could send funds directly to. In June 36, there was local elections, and here too, Rex broke through, and they even got more votes than they'd gotten in the national one. Mid-1936 would mark a turning point of gigantic proportions, although not in the direction Degrelle and Rex would have hoped. This would be the peak of Rex. First, however, there seemed to be better signs. In January 36, Mussolini had met Degrelle, and in August he began to pay the Rex party 250,000 lira a month. In September, Degrelle met Adolf Hitler, and the Führer personally offered him 100,000 Reichsmarks. It should be noted that Hitler gave VNV, the far more right-wing Flemish nationalist party, way more money, and also recurring payments, rather than a one-off payment. Verden Aarso was also offered money, but refused on principle. Degrelle also worked with the Flemish around this time, and he developed a sort of sympathy for the Flemish movement. He of course was a Belgian through and through, in the sense that he wanted to see the country remain united. However, Rex had a federal idea in mind, in which the Flemish would have far more autonomy, and VNV was also approached on this topic. Clearly this worked, as Hendrik Elias, future leader of the party, openly talked positively about Rex and their federalist allies in September. In October, the two parties announced their cooperation. Rex would help VNV get a federal state under the Belgian royal house, and they would then withdraw completely from Flanders and only be active in Wallonia and Brussels. The same in reverse was obviously also true. Most VNV voters, members, and even their leader did not support this, however, and the cooperation was essentially just a way to slow down Rex and win their own votes. Degrelle had his own game, and he planned to rule Belgium eventually under one big party. However, the VNV and the Flemish population at large would never have accepted such an arrangement. Inside Rex, there were voices that would never stand for such an arrangement. In Flanders, there was a privileged French-speaking minority who supported Rex, and this would require them to support VNV, a party who supported the repressed Flemish majority, which of course they could never stand for. Regardless, the issues on both sides were put to one side for the moment, and Rex pushed on. The left went berserk, as Rex and VNV together could form a huge right-wing front against the government. Many of them began to say that the duo had plans to march on Brussels, Mussolini style. Degrelle, years later in exile, would claim that if he did indeed march on Brussels, then the king would have 100% appointed him as prime minister. This of course was rather detached from reality. There was a real march, however, but it was a huge protest march against communism, and this was banned by the government. The left did more than fear an imaginary coup, however, they acted as well. In September, an attempt on Degrelle's life was made as he was giving a speech from on top of a boat in Charleroi. The perpetrators were Wallonian communists who attempted to shoot him from a bridge. This led Degrelle to meet with the leader of the Legion Nationale to discuss building up a Rexist militia. There was more dissent inside the party itself too. Degrelle was growing far too big for his boots, and many resented Degrelle's increasingly dictatorial style of running the party. Others felt that Degrelle had completely left behind Catholic activism for money and power. On one occasion, a man who had worked for Degrelle wrote a pamphlet critiquing him. In response, Degrelle wrote an article that was so brutal and so utterly filled with lies that even his most loyal readers could see how ridiculous it was. There was also a rumour around this time that Degrelle met with Joseph Goebbels to get money from Rex. However, Degrelle dismissed this and said that Goebbels was actually in Athens at the time, which was true. He then went further and said that he had never received any German funds, which of course wasn't true. The midterm elections were scheduled for the 11th of April 1937, but before then, Degrelle had some campaigning to do. In late 36, he ended up doing an incredible 25 meetings in 3 weeks. On one occasion, a French writer recalled Degrelle finishing a speech in one hall, going backstage, downing 2 beers, and then running to the other side of the building to give another speech. Degrelle later told a Rexist militant to go to Charleroi, and the man replied that he was tired and hadn't slept in 24 days. Degrelle replied, according to the French writer, quote, "You will have enough time to sleep when you are dead, just like me," end quote. When it came to the midterms, Degrelle was certain he would win, and he had even removed a Rexist parliamentarian in Brussels in March and decided to fill that seat himself, which he was sure he would win in the election. This turned out not to be the case. The midterms were a disaster, and a fight even broke out in Parliament, where Rexist Javier de Groen hit someone. In the lead up to the elections, Degrelle used the slogan, "Degrelle or Moscow," to death, to the point where people were just growing tired of him and his exaggerations. Years later, after the war, Degrelle would strangely claim that the Belgian chemical company Solvay, supporting Paul von Zeeland, had caused him to lose. This was an extremely odd claim, as firstly there was no proof, and secondly Solvay had even sent Mussolini money and were even involved with the building projects in Germany with the Nazis. In the end though, Paul von Zeeland breezed through and won the elections in Brussels with 76% of the vote. The only people who had warned Degrelle that things would end this way were the Flemish nationalists of the VNV. It was the beginning of the end. The clause came out, and even Archbishop Van Roo began openly talking about Rex. The party, and Degrelle especially, had grown far too big for their boots. After the elections, a Catholic Party magazine was published with the title Rex Quiescat in Pace, aka Rex, Rest in Peace. After this, Degrelle, sensing that everything was unravelling, attempted to reconcile himself with the greater Catholic movement, which he had just spent the last couple years trashing. They, of course, saw him as a dangerous liability and wanted nothing to do with the Rexists. Degrelle, in turn, broke off all contact. Things only got worse. In Parliament, a split emerged during a debate regarding amnesty for World War I Flemish collaborators. The Rexist position was officially against this. However, a Rexist politician spoke up in support of amnesty. Rex then split into two sides on the Flemish issue. There were those who were for Belgian unity, and those that wanted to give the Flemish people the amnesty, equality, justice, and sovereignty they've been clamouring for. In June 1937, Degrelle openly sided with the anti-Flemish side and attacked the idea of Dietsland, aka the Greater Netherlands. Degrelle claimed that only federalism would work. He went further and openly attacked his own deal with the VNV, which completely isolated the Rexist party from the Flemish movement and the Flemish people at large. Nothing could shake Degrelle from his idea of a federal state, which had him firmly at the helm. Paul de Man, the leader of Rex Flanders, soon came out against the new anti-Flemish stance a lot of the new members had, and said that this stance was totally against the core tenets of the party. He personally spoke up against Degrelle's megalomania, as he saw it, and soon enough he was shoved aside and then chose to leave the party. In late 1937, Paul von Zeeland's government fell, again, as it was revealed that he was involved in a fraud scandal. Earlier in the year, Degrelle had accused him of having received money from the Belgian National Bank. Zeeland denied this, yet later in the year, a commission found that Degrelle had in fact been absolutely correct. Zeeland resigned in disgrace, and the king appointed Paul Emil Janssen to head the government, but the parties of the government remained the same, and so little changed. This scandal, however, gave Rex a second wind of sorts. The internal problems remained, however. Rex's parliamentarian Javier de Groen, the man from the fight earlier in the year, came out and agitated against the church during a speech. Degrelle, on the other hand, wanted to make up with the church. Again, a split formed, and so de Groen was fired. Another parliamentarian left too, named Luc Hertog. Luc was a Jew, and he despised the new anti-Semitic trend within the party, and so off he went. The main editor of Le Pays Real newspaper quit too, and he stated that it was due to Degrelle's megalomania and selfishness. All in all, pretty much everyone who ended up leaving during this time stated that Degrelle himself was the problem, or at least the main problem. Degrelle had always been extremely cocky and self-centered, yet the past few years of fame had completely gone to his head, and so his personality either completely repelled or completely captured people. The former was now becoming far more common than the latter, however, as such a personality has to walk a very fine line in order to win over hearts and minds. As 1938 rolled around, the party became more and more fascist, authoritarian, and anti-Semitic. Most importantly, the party became more and more centred on Degrelle, as he viewed himself as a Belgian Hitler by now. Degrelle would completely deny that anti-Semitism existed in the party, yet by 1938, all the Jewish members had left the party. The public and the private Degrelle were becoming very hard to reconcile. One example is this, the Jewish question. In public, Degrelle openly and plainly stated that he felt all people were equal. In private, however, Degrelle spoke of how the Jews were the embodiment of three evils: communism, hypercapitalism, and anti-fascism. During the Kristallnacht media blowback in 1938, Rex attacked Jewish immigrants who came from Germany and Austria, and said that such newcomers should be banned from opening businesses until they had been living in Belgium for 5 years. Another example of Degrelle's change over the period was his opinion of Hitler. From 30 to 37, Degrelle did not like Hitler. He said that he was like Nero, and he cited the paganism of some elements of the National Socialist Party to support this. He also spoke about how he didn't like the outcome of the Munich conference. In 1936, Hitler had not been very impressed with Degrelle when they met, and the issue of the German-speaking lands in Belgium were to be a thorny one, as Rex had no interest in discussing the topic. Degrelle, though, quickly shifted his stance on Hitler, much as he had on the Jewish question. After the Rexist losses of 1937, Italy pulled the plug on Rex too. In total, Degrelle had been paid 19 million lira by Mussolini, but by now, Degrelle was just seen as dead weight, and so the Duce cut him loose. Leon, however, remained a big fan of Mussolini and saw him as the leading man of Europe. He said that Mussolini was important to defend Latin countries from what he termed Germanic savagery. This last term would become especially ironic years later, as he tried to portray the Wallonians themselves as Germanics to fit into Hitler's new Europe. In Flanders, Degrelle's stock continued to decline too. In mid-1938, there was a big Rexist Landdag in Flanders, where 30,000 people showed up. These paled in comparison to the big V&V and Verdeneso versions of these meetings. In the press afterwards, Degrelle was ripped to shreds, and they claimed that the Rexist cause was totally foreign to the Flemish people. One paper said that Rexism was just a big student joke. Verdeneso member, Paul Leroy, said that the event looked more like a town fair than a political meeting. Degrelle was even an hour late, and Leroy laughed at the fact that Rex and its militants had zero discipline, something that Verdeneso held in high regard. Regardless, V&V and Rex would work together in the 1938 municipal elections, but this hardly halted the terminal Rex decline. The issues, as ever, were the same. People simply did not like Degrelle and his bombastic style of leadership. This was a time when people wanted peace more than anything. Europe had just dodged a war over the Sudeten crisis, and the people of Belgium certainly didn't want such a controversial leader at this time. Rex displayed open sympathy for fascism and National Socialism by now, and in traditionally left-wing Wallonia, this was absolutely beyond the pale. After the elections, whilst Degrelle was on vacation in Portugal, there was talk of a coup inside the party. Some even said that the new leader was chosen in Paul de Mont. In January 1939, Degrelle returned and wrote an open letter to the party and the media that he did not appreciate the talk regarding a coup. The party continued to fracture, and Degrelle's opponents took full advantage when it came to the propaganda war, and Rex was slandered left and right. Things got worse. Degrelle went bankrupt around this time, and he had to ask his capitalist backers to rescue the party, and he was forced to moderate his message as a result. Later in 1939, yet another Belgian government fell due to a scandal involving a Flemish collaborator from the First World War. This case caused a rift between Rex and the Flemish once again, and the pro-Flemish section of the party openly revolted. Many original and important Rexists quit the party over this debacle. Right after this, another crisis hit Degrelle. Raphael Syndic was an original Rexist, and he'd quit the party due to Degrelle. Now he was accusing Leon of having used the money given by militants to fund his own lavish lifestyle. Degrelle had even used this money for such trivial things as electrifying his own desk with bells in order to call people to him. Millions of francs had been hidden by Degrelle for the personal usage of him and his closest party members. These accusations were proven true, and Degrelle was left in quite the bind. Degrelle had portrayed himself as a Robin Hood type character, who takes from the rich capitalists and gives to the poor, yet this clearly wasn't the case, as Degrelle was just enriching himself and his very closest friends to the tune of millions of francs. The drama made it to the national news, and it was over for Degrelle, and thus, for Rex, his political career was done. In the months leading up to the national elections, 8 of the 12 members of the Chamber of Representatives left the party, and 3 of the 12 senators did the same. The regional cause of the party ceased to exist, and the V&V was considering just pulling the plug on their work with Rex. Degrelle pushed on and put himself on the list for the elections. He didn't change election tactics either, and used his usual bombastic style to no avail. Everyone in the country, by now, viewed him as a liar and a megalomaniac. Degrelle and Rex had been completely and utterly discredited, and as expected, the elections were a disaster of gigantic proportions. Only 4 of the 21 seats in the Chamber of Representatives remained, and Rex lost half of their votes in Brussels. The Catholic Party had been completely revitalised, and they were back on top. Meanwhile, V&V had won big. In terms of numbers, the Rexist party had only just over 100,000 votes, which amounted to only 4.44% of the total. There was no coming back, it was completely over. During Degrelle's first speech in the new parliament, he went wild, shouting out, quote, "I have fought against your regime, and now I stand here to fight against how this parliament works. Europe is dying, not because of a lack of money and resources, but because she has lost her soul," end quote. Parliament could only hold in their laughter as the man who had just been so discredited over a financial scandal lectured them on the topic of money and resources. Importantly, during the elections, Degrelle had been openly critical of German foreign policy, and later the pact between the Nazis and the Soviets would lead to a lot of bad blood with Germany for Rex. Degrelle staunchly defended the official standpoint of Belgium at the time, that being neutrality. In September, when war broke out in Europe, Degrelle was invited to talk to the king regarding the situation. Leon pledged his absolute loyalty to King Leopold III. Degrelle had promised his loyalty to the king, yet by 1939, Degrelle's word meant next to nothing. This became clear when in December 1939, a huge scandal developed as a Rexist man from Charleroi was caught giving the Germans information on Allied troop movements in exchange for payments. Dissent against Degrelle himself grew within the party, and soon enough, most important Rexists were demanding that Degrelle step aside as party leader so that the party could revitalise itself. The scandals surrounding him were simply too much, and both at home and abroad he was viewed as a terrible leader and a terrible politician. His name had become essentially poison for any political movement. When the Germans moved into Denmark and Norway, Degrelle refused to address the situation, despite his earlier negative comments regarding Germany. He had chosen his path and saw which way the wind was blowing. A few months after this, half of the party just straight up quit, and Degrelle was left with an empty shell of a party. Rex had essentially ceased to exist. On the 9th of May 1940, the Belgian army mobilised, and the next day, the Germans were rolling through. The government had no intention of taking any chances, and any potential collaborators were immediately rounded up on the flimsiest of pretences. Rexists, such as Degrelle, were of course included, and others, such as V&V men like Ward Hermans and René Legros, who would later found the Germanic SS in Flanders, and members of Verdeneso were rounded up too. Their leader, Joris van Severen, and his right-hand man, Jan Rycourt, were shot out of hand by the French police once they were handed over 10 days later. Law and order had completely collapsed, and the Belgian regime had shown itself to be nothing but a puppet of France. The leader of the V&V was arrested, but this was seen as a step too far, as the Belgian state was worried that a majority of Flemish troops would simply desert, since their beloved leader had been locked up for absolutely no reason, and so he was released a few hours later. Degrelle and the others who hadn't already been murdered were the lucky ones, and they were sent to a concentration camp at the foot of the French Pyrenees. On the 28th of May, King Leopold threw in the towel in an attempt to save his nation further bloodshed, and deals were immediately attempted to free the deported prisoners. But of course, for some, it was already too late. They were dead and buried. The French were people that you certainly did not want to be imprisoned by during or shortly after World War II, and they treated their prisoners absolutely horrendously. It wouldn't be until the 21st of July that an extremely emaciated Degrelle was released from his captivity. Despite his physical torment, Léon was still mentally sharp and was dreaming big. He spoke to some of his party members and began planning for the future of the Belgian state, and even wrote down a list of people that he should form a government with. His companions, however, saw reality far more clearly than him, and they had to bring him back down to earth. Later in Paris, Degrelle was invited for a talk with Otto Abetz from the German embassy, and here Degrelle offered to govern Belgium with German help. After the dinner that took place following the talk, Degrelle gave his party member, Pierre Day, a note. On it was written Degrelle's desire to recreate Burgundy, the long-lost state which had ruled large areas of eastern France and the Low Countries. Today, it seemed that Degrelle had officially lost his marbles, but he was in fact deadly serious, and Léon waved away Day's logical objections. First and foremost, the dream was utterly utopian, and secondly, any kind of French-Belgian realignment of states would be totally unacceptable and illogical to both the Germans and, most importantly, the French themselves. Meanwhile, back in reality, in Belgium, the nation was ruled by a military government under Alexander von Falkenhausen, who was in fact quite the Francophile. All in all though, the Flemish were far more trusted than the Wallonians, and the V&V began to gain the upper hand in Belgium. Degrelle's Rex was so irredeemably broken that the party had considered just disbanding it. Upon Degrelle's return, however, he put a halt to such ideas, and set about revitalising the party for a new collaborationist role. Degrelle refused to accept that his party was dying, or essentially already dead, and in his mind he was not only determined, but sure that he would play a massive role in the future of Belgium, somehow. Degrelle, via Otto Abetz, had already attempted to get in contact with Hitler directly to discuss his new bright Burgundy idea. Abetz, before potentially wasting the Führer's time, wanted to know what Degrelle's plans even were. Degrelle then turned up with a bunch of old books and atlases and started showing Abetz Burgundy and telling him about how great of an ally Degrelle's new Burgundian state would be to Germany. Abetz quickly decided that Degrelle was a very small fish in a very big political pond and dismissed any idea of passing such an outlandish plan onto the Führer. Hitler's vague ideas for Belgium were certainly not what Degrelle had hoped for. On the 17th of July, Hitler decreed that the Flemish people should be helped as much as possible and that the Wallonians should be given absolutely nothing at all. Supporting the Flemish, a Germanic people who had been downtrodden by their French overlords, would open the door for many paths in the future. One of the most prominent ideas floating about at the time if the war was decisively won was that the Flemish could be incorporated into a greater Germanic state, but the idea of the time was in constant flux throughout the war, and like most German plans when it came to Hitler, nothing was set in stone. Von Falkenhausen, the devout Francophile, only had so much influence in a Führer state, too. The Flemish for the first time in their history had the upper hand, and Rex suffered even more as a result. The most important aspect of Germany's Flemish preference by far was the release of the Flemish POWs, but not the Wallonian ones. The Germans felt they could trust the former, but not the latter. Despite these huge setbacks, Degrelle and Rex created their official militia, which grew to around 4,000 people. However, this was substantially smaller than the VNV and Verden-Asso Flemish militias. In order to compete with the Flemish, Degrelle had to hug up to the Germans as much as physically possible. This was an easy decision for Degrelle, yet it would be a momentous one. He was going to cross the Rubicon, and this would be it. If Germany lost the war, he would be done for. On the 1st of January 1941, Degrelle's new position was officially announced, as he ended his article in Le Pays Real with "Heil Hitler." Just a month prior, Degrelle tried to rally around the king and was shouting, "God bless our king." Eggert Rieder, the administrator of Belgium, was far from impressed with Degrelle. He wrote to Berlin of Degrelle's new tactics, quote, "But Degrelle, who shouts Heil Hitler, while first he shouted God save the king, looks more and more like a charlatan, a liar, a propagandist, who would do anything out of political ambition," end quote. Rieder's ire extended to the party at large too. Quote, "VNV feels itself connected to Germany, as they are Germanics. The Heil Hitler of Degrelle is, in comparison, a speculative expression of confidence towards the builder of a new Europe, of which Degrelle expects will keep the Belgian state as it is. With Degrelle, who doesn't represent much, there is not cooperation to be had. The German press has to distance themselves from this man," end quote. These sentiments went all the way up. Heydrich wrote that working with Degrelle would be highly dangerous because of, quote, "his worldview, his vanity, and his lack of people knowledge," end quote. The Rex faithful, or what remained of them, were equally as disgusted by Degrelle's opportunism, and the resignation letters came pouring in. In April 1941, local politicians were appointed in Belgium. VNV got almost everything in Flanders, whereas in Wallonia, Germans were appointed everywhere, instead, except for a Rexist mayor in the party's strongest regions. Also in April, Degrelle tried a new tactic. He decided to straight up join the German army, and he sent a letter straight to Hitler declaring his intentions. According to Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler personally dismissed this idea out of hand. Also by this point, Rex Flanders and Verden-Asso had been absorbed into VNV, and Rex now had absolutely nothing in Flanders. Degrelle was in desperate straits. It is important to note Degrelle's own thoughts on the situation in Belgium and his own collaboration. He writes in his memoirs, The Eastern Front, quote, "The German onrush overwhelmed our country. For 99% of the Belgians or the French, the war was over by July 1940. The predominance of the Reich was a fact, to which, moreover, the old democratic and financial regime ardently wanted to adapt itself as quickly as possible. Among those who had insulted Hitler in 1939 were many who would be the most eager to throw themselves at the feet of the conqueror in 1940. The heads of the great parties of the left, the financial magnates, the owners of the largest newspapers, the Masonic ministers of state, the former government, all of them wanted, sought, and desired any opportunity for collaboration. Was it necessary to surrender the field to the discredited ghosts of the old parties, to the gangsters of a financial system whose only allegiance was to gold, or to sinister pirates lacking both talent and dignity, eager for the meanest tasks of a valet to satisfy their greed and ambition? The problem was not only sad, it was urgent. To nearly all observers, the Germans appeared to be final victors. It was necessary to make up one's mind. Could we, out of fear of taking responsibility, just let our country drift?" End quote. He continued on later, quote, "It was clear that our country was going to be made to wait until peace returned. By that time, it would be too late. We had to win. Before the war ended, the right to negotiate with Germany on an effective basis. How were we to achieve this? Collaboration within the country was nothing more than an operation of slow encirclement, of nibbling in bits and bytes, of endless struggles for influence carried out against obscure secondary personages. Not only would that work confer no prestige to whoever undertook it could only discredit them. That was a trap I did not want to fall into. I watched and waited for a different approach. Suddenly, in June 1941, I had my chance. Germany had gone to war with the Soviet Union." End quote. From the moment the first German boot crossed the frontier into the Soviet Union, all of Europe, except for Britain, chose its side. Degrelle writes, quote, "Between that age-old Europe and the Soviet onslaught, its horrible levelling, the overflow of its swarming little tribes, they made their choice at once. A new generation, all over Europe, took its stand. Blonde giants from Scandinavia and the Baltic countries, Hungarian dreamers with long moustaches, stocky, swarthy Romanians, enormous Croats with violet greatcoats, Italians, whimsical and sentimental, Spaniards with jet black eyes, bantering Frenchmen, Danes, Dutch, Swiss, all hastened to the battle for Europe. All the nations were there. We even saw some Englishmen volunteer, a dozen in all, a dozen, none the less." End quote. Among this throng of young men rushing to join the United European cause were of course plenty of Wallonians and Flemings alike. The SS was given responsibility for Germanic volunteers, and the Wehrmacht was given responsibility for the others, and so Degrelle's Walloons, of course, were with the army for now. At first, Degrelle considered himself too old and didn't think of signing up for combat himself, and by mid-July there were only 200 men in the Wallonian Legion. After this initial disappointment, Degrelle knew what he had to do, and he signed up himself as a lowly private. He then began putting his oratory skills to good use, and soon enough, 850 more Wallonians followed Degrelle's admirable example and joined the cause. Soon enough, he was marching through the streets with his Wallonians, holding Burgundian flags high. In August, Degrelle and his men left Belgium for basic training, and the party leadership had been handed over to Victor Mathies. In late 1941, the Walloons were off to Ukraine, and Degrelle marvelled at the sheer destruction that had been dealt to the Soviet forces. Wreck after wreck, and body after body, littered the countryside that Leon and his men's trains ran through. When they finally reached their destination at Dnipropetrovsk, Degrelle described the reaction of his men. Quote, 75% of our soldiers were manual labourers. Many among them had been susceptible, once, to Soviet propaganda. They stood with their mouths agape when they saw in what conditions of decay and exhaustion the Russian proletariat existed. They shook their heads, having to look twice at the scene before believing it. End quote. The Wallonians would spend the next few months in the mud and filth of Ukraine, dealing with the seemingly endless horde of partisans that were harassing the extremely overextended German supply lines. This style of warfare was quite the baptism of fire for Degrelle and his boys, many of whom hadn't even held a gun before just a few months prior. Even traversing the terrain was a task in and of itself. Degrelle writes, quote, "With minds troubled, bodies drained of strength, we had to confront an enemy in front of us, behind us, on our flanks. The mud squelched our spirits. Our weakest broke down, exhausted. During the first phase of combat, one of our men collapsed in the mire, his head blown open, his courage at an end. He had shot himself in the mouth with his rifle." End quote. Of the partisans themselves, Degrelle writes, quote, "The Soviet partisans formed military units of a special sort. They were nowhere, yet they were everywhere. During the day, crouching in a thicket, lurking inside a haystack, peeking from the attic window beneath the skylight of a nisba, their lookout silently observed the enemy's every step. They noted our supply sheds and equipment, learned our trails and pathways, spied on the advanced work of the engineers. One night, they dynamited a bridge and set some trucks on fire. Strong bursts of fire came from a slope. We ran, but we were too late. In the vicinity, we found an old line shapska, some tracks of felt boots, nothing else. The forest had noiselessly absorbed the fugitives." End quote. This was what the inexperienced Wallonians had to deal with, day in, day out. It was enough, as noted, to drive many to insanity or worse. Despite their daunting task, however, Degrelle and his men persevered. On one occasion, the Walloons had to cross 25 metres of an iced-over river to take a series of solid bunkers, and this they did without a second thought, although they lost many men in the bloody battle. Degrelle wrote in his usual romantic fashion, quote, "The Russian earth received our dead. How many others were going to fall? In the ice, in the mud, or under the golden sun, in the Donets or on the Don, in the Caucasus and in Estonia. Those first crimson drops, scattered like petals on the snow of the Samara, had the unforgettable purity of the first gifts, the first lilacs, the first tears." End quote. As the year drew to a close, the Wallonians had to undergo a grueling 200-kilometre advance, and whilst en route, Degrelle lamented at how few churches he saw. Most had been razed to the ground by the Soviets, and the ones that remained were used as storage, the floor often covered in manure or corn. Quote, "Over a period of 2 years, we travelled more than 2,000 kilometres on foot, from Dnipropetrovsk to the threshold of Asia. We were able to count on our fingers the number of churches encountered en route, all desecrated." End quote. This march was hell on earth, and the winter of 41 to 42 has gone down in history for its sheer ferocity. Quote, "The countryside through which the storms buffeted us bristled with Soviet mines. The snow had blanketed them, just as it had the warning stakes placed here and there by the first crew of German scouts. Lost among blasts of wind which drifted the snow as much as 3 meters high, one of our companies blundered into a Soviet minefield. The young commander, a former captain in the Belgian army who bore the lovely country name Dupree, was riding ahead when his horse stepped on one of those horrible devices. The horse shot 2 meters straight up in the air and landed, his guts shattered, whilst the rider lay helpless in the red snow, his legs torn to shreds. The howling steppe shrieked its victory. Our soldiers had to brace his shattered limbs with 2 pieces of wood, and then transport their ill-fated captain on some fir tree branches. After several kilometers, they reached a deserted Ispa. It took 26 hours before an all-weather ambulance could come to the aid of the dying captain. He had 11 fractures, smoking his cigarette in quick, avid puffs. He said his goodbyes to his men. Great beads of sweat poured down his face as he silently endured his agony. He died without a word of regret, while taking one last drag on his cigarette. End quote. The deeply Catholic Wallonians spent Christmas in minus 20-degree weather. Quote, on Christmas Eve, we attended midnight mass at a church reconsecrated by our chaplain. A Russian choir sang in shrill, heart-rending tones. Outside, the snow fell in large flakes. Lying behind their machine guns, several of our soldiers occupied combat positions at the four corners of the building. End quote. In mid-January, the weather plummeted to nearly minus 40 degrees, and the Europeans, far from used to such weather, suffered horribly, especially the Italians who were posted near the Walloons. Whether Degrelle had killed anyone up to this point, he does not say, but in January he was part of an execution squad, tasked with taking care of 2 Soviet spies. Quote, when we reached the middle of the steppe, we lined up in a row. The 2 condemned men, their hands in their pockets, did not say a word. Our volley knocked them down. There was an extraordinary moment of silence, in which the shudder of the rifle shots floated skyward. One of the 2 communists moved, as if he wanted to summon up a last remnant of life. His right hand left his pocket and rose, fist clenched tightly, above the snow, and we heard a cry, a last cry, shouted in German so that it would be understood by all. Hail Stalin. The dead man's clenched fist fell back to his side. End quote. In January, the weather remained as bad, and even dipped slightly lower at times, and Degrelle's Walloons, as well as their German allies, had to face off against seemingly endless hordes of Cossacks and Siberians. These men may have been far better prepared than their European counterparts for the cold, but they certainly weren't prepared for such fierce fighting. It was a slaughter, and the Walloons were able to hold their heads high afterwards. Quote, all of them were mercilessly swept aside. The horses fell dead, their forelegs twisted beneath them. The handsome Cossacks rolled in the snow, in all directions, or were frozen solid by the cold on their saddles, united in death with their mounts. The Siberian infantry had rushed to the attack as naively as the Cossacks, storming down 2 hills and then across the steppe. None had been able to come closer than 30 meters from the houses. The bodies of several hundred Siberians lay scattered in the snow. End quote. Degrelle himself could only have so much luck in such engagements, however, and soon enough he had a very close call when the Walloons were attacked by Russian fighters. Quote, they dove, turned, came back again. Together with some comrades, I ran to see a heavy munitions wagon sunk in the middle of the road. An easy target which could go up at any moment. I pushed with all my strength to move it to the protection of an embankment. The planes swooped down again, and the vehicle tipped, pinning me. Everything went black. I awoke again half an hour later, lying in a hut. My eyes could distinguish only great swirls of mauve, like orchids. My left foot had been fractured in 2 places. I understood that they wanted to send me to a hospital. That woke me up completely. The ambulance men, who had brought me in, had at their disposal a horse and a narrow sled. I had them lay me out on that. Then across the dead bodies encrusted in the ice, I started the animal out in the direction of the east. End quote. The rest of February was to be even worse for the Walloons. Quote, as we crossed the frozen ponds, the Russians to the east opened up on us with an extremely fierce artillery barrage. The troops had been able to run up to the Ispas to get a little cover. Flattened at the bottom of my sled, incapable of taking a step, I heard the shrapnel ricocheting on the sides, against the planks. A Croat who ran up, his arms extended, had just fallen on me. He had a monstrous red hole, as large as 2 fists, where his eyes had once been. So it was that we entered the village of Gromovaya Bolka, where we were to lose half of our legionnaires, killed or wounded. End quote. For 10 days, the Wallonians held out in the most barbaric of conditions, dying in numerous ways from both the enemy and the elements. There were 500 of them, with a single tank, and a handful of survivors from the SS Viking, who had managed to escape the slaughter in a village just 3 kilometers away. Opposing this isolated village was thousands upon thousands of Soviets, who seemingly cared little for their own lives as they came in, wave after wave. Degrelle himself, suffering from his injury which was being feasted upon by various bugs, felt that he had no choice but to join the fray. Quote, kicking off the splint that encased my foot, I limped forward, with my rifle as a crutch, across the open ground to join my squad. My pain forgotten, I took my post at my machine gun once again. End quote. His men held on valiantly, yet the odds were simply too overwhelming. House by house fell under the weight of sheer Soviet brutality, as tanks flattened whatever isolated groups they came across. Degrelle on one occasion found himself utterly alone and isolated, as every single man that was with him had been slaughtered. One of his Walloon comrades had to crawl all the way over to him and drag the injured Degrelle on a sled back to safety, only for the rescuer himself to die an agonizing death moments later. Degrelle's life was saved, however. The village fell, but just in the nick of time, German Stukas showed up and sent crowds of bunched up Soviets flying into the air, and the village was retaken. Then the planes left, and bitter fighting took place which eventually, somehow, resulted in a decisive Wallonian victory, at least for a time. It was a glorious, although Pyrrhic one, however, and the Walloons had been decimated. It was time to withdraw. Eventually, the village simply became a ruin that resembled a no man's land. By the 2nd of March, the Wallonian Legion had only 1/3 of its former strength. Of 26 officers, there were now 2, and soon enough this was reduced to 1, as the other had a nervous breakdown and was evacuated. Quote, "We were relieved at noon. Our boys, emaciated, unshaven, returned from their posts with proud looks on their faces. The heroism they had shown in combat was already a watchword all along the Donetsk front. The commander of the 100th Division had just awarded them 33 Iron Crosses. At that time this was, for one battalion, an extraordinary number. A still more striking honour came as we were specially cited in the Wehrmacht Order of the Day in the communiqué from the High Command." End quote. After the action in Ukraine, Degrelle had to return to Belgium for some leave, as there had been a course of attacks against Rexists by the resistance early that year. Whilst he had to sort out the mess, Degrelle pushed for the Germans to release the Wallonian captives so that they could be used to fill the ranks of the Wallonian Legion, as now he simply did not have enough men after their recent thinning. In order to promote the cause, Degrelle had a new wacky idea. He began proclaiming that Walloons were actually Germanics. If this were accepted by the Germans, then the Walloons could be seen as equal to their Flemish counterparts, and also would be able to have their own legion become part of the SS. This theory was of course nonsense. By September, only 300 Walloon captives had been released, and only 140 of these ended up joining the German army. This wasn't through a lack of trying on Degrelle's part, however, and the German army leadership noted his efforts. Degrelle even met with Steiner of the SS Viking to discuss Walloons being allowed into the SS. Leon even lied and claimed that Rex was a nod to the town name where the movement was founded, whereas it was actually derived from Christus Rex, aka Christ the King in Latin. Having a Latin name origin sounded less appealing whilst claiming to be Germanic. Steiner acknowledged Degrelle and sent Himmler a letter recommending recognition of Walloons as Germanics. However, Himmler found it far too early to do this, and the bizarre strategy was denied. Degrelle also succeeded in completely alienating what remained of the Rexists back home in Belgium via this strategy, as he was denying their very heritage and twisting history so that his people appeared to be something of which they were not. Degrelle had also begun speaking out against the monarchy, which greatly offended many Rexists and Walloons at large. Gradually, however, at least with the Germans, Degrelle was winning them over by his sheer tenacity. Soon enough, Himmler accepted Degrelle's claim that Walloons were Germanic, so that they would come under his authority. Reeder, too, accepted that Walloons had some Germanic blood, but he also noted that Degrelle used history as a weapon extremely liberally. Upon his return to the front, Degrelle joined his men in the Second Battle of Kharkov, in which they showed themselves to be quite the fighting force. Only then, after the battle, did the new recruits slowly start to trickle in from back home. Soon enough, these men from Wallonia were heading off towards Asia, thousands upon thousands of kilometres from their homeland. Case Blue, Hitler's attempt to capture the Caucasus oil fields, was now in effect. Quote, "The months of the summer offensive of 1942 were the most exciting months of the anti-Soviet war. The South, its dazzling fruits, its semi-tropical vegetation, its African sun, its great sparkling rivers. Each one of us believed that victory lay at the end of that miraculous cavalcade. The Soviets had not even risen to the challenge. They were fleeing. At a mad pace, hundreds of thousands of men rushed off in pursuit of them." End quote. The progress was rapid and seemingly unstoppable. Town after town was liberated, as the locals saw it, and Degrelle remembers well the villagers' reactions. Quote, "The natives received us with obvious joy. Often we were the first troops to enter their hamlet. The good people immediately went to the outbuildings, removed their icons from the former hiding places, and hung them once more on their dried mud walls, tears streaming down their faces. The greatest gift that one could confer on them was to give them a portrait of Hitler. Often they would hang it next to their icons. They would even put it between the photos of their boys, dressed in the uniform of the Soviet army, red stars on their caps. Such photographic fraternization appeared perfectly natural to them. They loved their boys very much. They loved Hitler very much for having liberated their village. They combined the two." End quote. Of the rapid offensive, he wrote, quote, "Thousands, tens of thousands of Soviets surrendered. They could do no more. To tell the truth, we carried out the offensive much more with our feet than with our rifles. Many of our men, their feet sore, fell out. That hardly mattered. They would catch up to us later. The Soviet soldiers just let themselves be captured. They sat there by the thousands, sucking their bare and bloody toes. Most of them were Asiatics. They had the good large heads of cannibals, delighted not to be eaten in their turn. They repeated tirelessly, 'Stalin kaput, Stalin kaput,' stopping their monologue only to suck the swollen corns off their feet." End quote. The Walloons, like the rest of the Axis forces in the east, were overwhelmed by their progress and thought this would certainly be it. Eternal victory in their eyes was just over the horizon. Quote, "The mountains were still 50 kilometers distant, but their summits stood out clearly against the sky. We were flooded with a joy that goaded us forward. There they were, the peaks that had lived in our imagination for weeks." End quote. Soon enough, Degrelle and his men were at Maikop. Their final objective was Sukhumi, not far from the Turkish border. Quote, "We made some bets. Tbilisi by Christmas, Babylon by the spring. On the banks of those sacred rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, we would meet Marshal Rommel's Africa Corps, advancing from the Suez Canal. The war would end in the cradle of civilization." End quote. It was in this spirit that the Walloons celebrated the Feast of the Ascension, getting drunk on local, foul-smelling wine until early in the morning. The world was at their feet. This was, as we now know, an illusion. The Germans had been lured into the Russian abyss. Quote, "We arrived at a large green river that surged through the rubble of a dynamited bridge. A soldier advanced, straggling the jagged platform. A rifle shot rang out from a tree on the other side. The man fell into the river. A second man tried, then a third. They fell, hit in turn. The mountains were still 20 kilometers away, but already the Caucasus were sending us a warning. We had raced south for 1,150 kilometers. We believed that we had conquered everything. The free bodies bobbing in the torrents informed us suddenly that perhaps the war in the south, rather than ending, was just beginning." End quote. Soon enough, Degrelle himself was nearly a casualty. Quote, "We were at the mercy of any lazy or haphazard shell. Our troubles began immediately. One of our posts was blown up. Another shell, 120mm, and particularly whimsical, fell 80 centimeters from me, tossing me through the air on a whirlwind of fire. When I regained consciousness, I found myself amid heaps of wreckage. Around me, everything had been slashed or razed for 20 meters. The right side of my steel helmet had been completely caved in and splintered, up to my ear. My canteen had blossomed like a flower. My machine gun, set within arm's reach, had been blown to bits. Everyone thought I'd been vaporized. I had, all in all, a shell splinter in my right forearm, a perforated eardrum, and a long tear in my stomach. The last wound would prove serious later on, and mar for a long time my life in exile." End quote. Soon enough, once again, the Walloons had fought bravely, but been decimated. Many acts of Wallonian heroism litter Degrelle's memoirs, but the odds they faced were impossible. It was time to go home. Quote, "We were at the end of our physical strength, the end of our spiritual resources. We struggled on only because our honour as soldiers was on the line. Volunteers, we wanted to remain so until the bitter end, until the last beat of our exhausted hearts. We no longer hoped for anything. One morning, reading the orders, we stared with vacant eyes at a paragraph that named the hour and conditions for our relief. It took us a long time to understand. Nevertheless, it was really true. The Wallonian Legion was to return to Belgium. It would receive 3 weeks home leave, and there be reinforced by several thousand Belgian volunteers. We went back down on the long muddy mountainside we had climbed so painfully one night in October. What had become of our wretched companions who that night had toiled and suffered while hauling themselves silently to the summit of the mountain? Of our legion, decimated by the first winter in the Donets, completely rebuilt in June 1942, before the Great Southern Offensive, there still remained, in all exactly, 187 men when we came again to the little wooded bridge over the Fish." End quote. And so the Walloons went home. They would not see combat again until late 1943. Degrelle said of this time when it came to the Legion, quote, "A number of officers and soldiers of the old Belgian army who had been prisoners in the Reich camps had asked to enlist. They came to us, several hundred of them, in the glorious old uniforms in which they tried to check the German advance in May 1940. Thus the two armies joined together fraternally, the one that had heroically defended the integrity of our country in 1940, and the one that, overcoming past resentments, had striven, since August 1941, to help save the essential, Europe, and our fatherlands all across Europe. The working class constituted 3/4 of the strength of our Legion, but the Legion also included numerous young people from the aristocracy and the Belgian bourgeois class, gold medalists from Jesuit colleges, sons of well-known diplomats, jurists, civil servants, businessmen. An identical purpose united us all, to represent our people brilliantly among the 20 nations that had joined the struggle, to fulfill, without civility, our duty as Europeans, by fighting against the mortal enemy of Europe, to obtain for our mother country a strong voice in the continental community that would be born out of the war, and finally, to gird the shock troops, whose might would guarantee social justice upon our permanent return to our country after the hostilities. For this ideal, we offered our lives. This offering was not mere rhetoric. Of the 6,000 Belgian volunteers who joined the Wallonian Legion between autumn of 1941 and spring of 1945, 2,500 died as heroes. 83% of our soldiers received 1 or more wounds in the course of this mighty epic. Of the first 800 volunteers, 3 alone of those who had taken part in all the battles reached the end of the war alive, a simple soldier, a junior officer who became a captain, wounded 3 times, and the author of these lines, himself wounded on 5 occasions." End quote. Before heading back into the fray, however, Degrelle had a turbulent 1943 at home. The most noticeable incident involves Degrelle and his wife. Essentially, whilst Degrelle had been away, his wife had been sleeping with an Austrian Luftwaffe officer named Helmuth Pessel, and this had been going on for years now. During a vacation to France in 1943, Degrelle's wife confessed to all of this, and Degrelle completely lost it, and openly challenged Pessel to a duel, but the Germans refused to allow it. Even despite confessing, however, Degrelle's wife, Marie, went and met Pessel in Paris. It was clear that the affair was coming to an end now that everything had become public, so this was presumably their last hurrah. After this, Pessel sent letters to both Hitler and Degrelle in which he threatened to kill himself, and Marie, too, said she wanted to kill herself. Léon, however, would obviously not take such a humiliation laying down. A week later, Pessel was found dead near Degrelle's villa in Brussels, and on the 12th of April, Degrelle called the German authorities to tell them Pessel had killed himself. A basic autopsy showed that Pessel had multiple gunshot wounds to the back of his head, however, so I'm sure you can piece this story together. Degrelle was far too important to the Wallonian Legion to get in trouble for this, and so the story was hushed up thanks to Léon's SS friends. The relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Degrelle never recovered. Also, all this time, Degrelle had been having multiple affairs of his own in Paris. There was other trouble too. In April, Degrelle was attempting to buy a new office building, but the notary who was helping him to do this was actually a partisan spy who had been planning to assassinate him for months. Another spy, a German one, had infiltrated this operation, however, and as the notary went to Degrelle's home to complete the job, he was apprehended in the act. In May, despite his newspaper saying he was at the front, Degrelle was actually with Himmler in East Prussia, where the talks to officially integrate the Walloons into the SS were taking place. Here, Himmler dominated the talks, and Degrelle began to concede to everything. Walloons were now officially French-speaking Germanics, and Degrelle gave up all of his views on a federal Belgium, and accepted that the Germans could annex his own homeland into a centralised future pan-Germanic state, which is what Himmler had favoured as his post-war goal. Degrelle would later claim that it was he himself who proposed all this, or deny it altogether, or come up with a different version, but this simply wasn't true, as his translator later confirmed. As for the annexation of Belgium itself, Degrelle would keep this reorientation of his political beliefs very quiet after the war, and would only mention the talks with Himmler in a bid to over-exaggerate his own role in the conflict. In June, the Wallonian Legion officially became part of the SS. By now, however, Rex was a dead party. The party only had 8,000 members, and whilst Degrelle was making a name for himself elsewhere, he was increasingly becoming a much hated figure at home. Everyone didn't trust Rex and Degrelle, and this hostility essentially became unbearable. The next month, Degrelle gained himself even more enemies. At Mass on the 25th of July, Degrelle was quite rightly told by the Bishop of Namur to get changed, as armed forces uniforms were not allowed in churches. Instead of listening to the bishop, Degrelle simply beat him to the ground, spilled the wine and bread, and then had him dragged off by some of his Rexes into a basement where he was tortured and beaten. This was perhaps the overreaction of the century, and truly displays just how megalomaniacal Degrelle had become. He had completely lost his mind. On the 19th of August, Léon Degrelle was officially excommunicated from the Catholic Church, the only fascist to be excommunicated throughout the entire war. Only extremely unofficially would the Wallonian SS priest remove this excommunication later on. Degrelle made enemies of the local German military figures once again too. For some bizarre reason, he decided to send a letter to Hitler in which he badmouthed Rieder, the civilian administrator of Belgium. This letter ended up in Rieder's hands, and later, according to Rieder himself, Degrelle essentially begged him on his knees to forgive him. In November, Rieder was promoted, and Degrelle sent him flowers. Rieder wrote to his superiors, quote, "Will we tolerate this attitude by a Wallonian, who was until the war a massive Belgian nationalist, and waited until the opportune moment to magically declare himself German?" End quote. In January 1944, the military administration in Belgium was replaced by a civilian one. Later, Degrelle would claim complete credit for this, but this wasn't at all the case, as he had nothing to do with the process, and it was done behind his back. In late 1943, Hitler had actually flirted with the idea of annexing Flanders and the Netherlands into the Reich itself to form the foundation of a future pan-German nation. Hitler also thought of creating a new Gau, or province, named Gau Burgundy, which Degrelle would have gone wild for had he known. This would have encompassed all the former Burgundian lands except for the Dutch-speaking parts. Hitler, however, always flirted with various ideas, and just like all the others, this was fleeting and it was ditched. By late November, Degrelle and his men were back at the front in Ukraine. Week after week passed, and the Walloons never saw a soul. They were tormented by the partisans who picked them off, one by one, or blew up their trucks with mines. Not a single Russian prisoner was taken. It was as if their tormentors simply did not exist. Quote, We had to know, at any cost, what was going on in that purple and white forest. The peasants would whisper. We ended up learning from them that about 10,000 men were hiding out in this wooded mastiff of Shikasi. But where? They were receiving equipment. We saw, thanks to our forward observation posts, the Bolsheviks construct numerous bunkers and bring up anti-tank guns, which they moved frequently, but we only saw the first 100 metres. What lay beyond, under the immensity of pines and dark oaks, stretching clear to the Dnieper on the east and to Shikasi in the southwest. Every ISPA was a mystery, end quote. Despite his previous excommunication, Degrelle remained a devout, although obviously extremely flawed, Catholic, and he spoke at length on the religious services that took place amidst the Ukrainian people. He also touched on the confusing loyalties of the locals. Quote, I re-established worship services. A marvellous priest returned from the woods where he had been hiding for 23 years, officiated on Sundays from dawn until midday, dressed in purple and gold. The entire village attended the ceremonies, prostrating themselves 100 times, kissing the earth 100 times, intoning for hours melancholy and passionate chorales that would break your heart. Dozens of icons shone by candlelight in their copper and silver shrines. The yellow-bearded priest would baptize the week's babies. He made them kiss the icons interminably, one by one. Then he paraded each one of the newborns across the chapel, howling their heads off. He held them up at arm's length towards the congregation, so that the whole village could see and contemplate the arrival of new parishioners. He would finally return them, dead tired, to their flat-cheeked mothers, modest yet glowing, dressed, like all the women of Baibusi, in long monastic capes, brown, decorated with a few ruffles above the waist, woven in the village. No matter what the combats of the night, I regularly attended the Orthodox worship on Sunday mornings, among elderly peasants with bushy beards, beside honest mamkas and louse-ridden brats. After hours and hours of prayers by the priest, our chaplain would chant the Catholic Mass. Not a single member of the Ukrainian congregation would leave. These people were starved for religious life, and they would kneel, deeply moved, during our communion. While helping the elderly gentleman of my ISPA, who had lost his right leg in the last war, I returned to my command post covered with vermin, but moved by the admirable simplicity of manners and the faith of these peasants. Nevertheless, from the same little houses, every night, the hootings of owls would go forth, directed at the partisans. We couldn't be angry with our villagers for having paternal hearts, but we watched them vigilantly. The naive goodness, quite naturally, overcame all our Western complexities. They loved their compatriots who were shooting at us from the neighbouring outskirts of the forest, but they also bore witness to us personally, who lived in their town and under their roofs, of an equal affection, simple, strong, and sincere. In the evening, when I put on my white coat and crossed my cartridge clips in the Cossack manner, the old mamka would kneel before the icons. At dawn, when I returned from combat, the old folks were waiting for me. I put down my arms, steaming with cold. The old mama would cross herself, cry, touch my garments. I wasn't dead. Poor people, gentle and good, who had to pray at the same time for us, taken in as sons of the house, and for their own children, hiding out across the way, end quote. The next few months consisted of absolutely brutal warfare against partisans and enemy troops alike. It was chaos, draining chaos, and the Walloons were feeling the strain. On Christmas Day of 1943 alone, the Walloons lost 15 men to suicide. On that night, too, dozens of men were found by Degrelle crying their eyes out, lamenting how much they missed home. Even earlier, in 1943, and into the coming months, the Walloons would have a gigantic problem with mass desertions, and many of them were shot by their own men. It should also be noted that in later memoirs, interviews, and at the time, the Germans themselves would categorically state that the Flemish Legion was superior. To quote a staff officer from the 6th SS Panzer Army, quote, the Flemings were by far more reliable than their Wallonian counterparts, end quote. This doesn't take away how bravely the Walloons fought, of course, as that is beyond doubt. The ones that stayed were among the bravest that Europe threw up against the Soviets. Yet, the fact remains that there were huge problems with desertion. Soon enough, the Axis forces in Ukraine were in trouble. Quote, to tell the truth, our position at that point on the Dnieper was untenable. We occupied the tip of a long lance. The Viking Division and the Assault Brigade Wallonia were the only southeast forces still positioned on the Great Ukrainian River. Sooner or later, we were going to be cut off. Upon our arrival in November 1943, it was already evident that we were doomed. At the beginning of January 1944, the truth of this was more overwhelming still, end quote. Hitler himself had stood firm when it came to staying put on the Dnieper, if only for reasons of morale. This position could also be used in future for an offensive towards Kharkov, he reasoned. Hitler's optimism and stubbornness was to prove misplaced this time. The Walloons were forced into attack after attack, where they were torn to pieces. In 1 hour, on one occasion, 125 men were killed or wounded. It was massacre after massacre after massacre. As always, when it came to fighting the Soviets, there was gigantic and disproportionate losses on the Soviet side. But again, as always, there seemed to be an endless supply of bodies from Karelia all the way to Mongolia and beyond to throw into the mix. Soon enough, disaster struck. Quote, "Back at the command post, 2 hours later, a telephone call from the division informed us in one fateful sentence. The Soviet forces have made their junction in the southeast. 11 German divisions, more or less complete, were surrounded. Exactly 1 year after the tragedy on the Volga, a second Stalingrad was beginning." End quote. On the 28th of January, the Walloons, like their German counterparts, were stuck in the Cherkasy pocket, faced with imminent annihilation. Degrelle, however, was anything but a pessimist. This was where the Walloons would make their names in the history books forevermore. "We were beginning to get used to the pocket. Survivors of 100 traps, on the Donets, on the Don, and in the Caucasus, we felt this was scarcely our first crisis. We all wanted to think this encirclement would be just one more adventure. The High Command wouldn't abandon us here. The counterattack would break the Soviet ring for certain." A radio telegram from the celebrated General Hube had in theory settled the business. The telegram was nice and short. "I'm coming." The general came. End quote. Within 2 days, the Germans had eaten away at the ring. 110 tanks and dozens of villages had already fallen. On paper, all that was left was to break through a 9-kilometre wide line of enemy trenches. The next blow that struck, however, was not by the Germans, but by the Soviets. The German tanks were forced to beat a hasty retreat, and that 9 kilometres quickly became 50. The pocket itself was squeezed too. There was still, initially, help at hand, however, as supplies were ferried into the Korsun landing strip that remained in the pocket. About 70 Junkers transport planes would arrive daily with all the essentials and would depart with the wounded. Soon enough, however, there was a thaw and the Russian sludge came through. There would be no more planes, and the men were on their own. The westwards retreat before an attempted breakout was brutal. Of one of the initial retreats, quote, "The night was nothing but an interminable free-for-all, savage, howling, amid the blackness and the raw red of the fires. The long village was evacuated quarter by quarter, hour by hour, only when all the equipment had been hauled to the southern zone. Our telephone communications weren't interrupted for a single minute. We knew with absolute precision how our equipment was being withdrawn. The soldiers fought from Ispa to Ispa, their fury mirrored in their eyes, beset by waves of Mongols who leaped from bushes, hedges, sheds, and even from the filth of the dunghills." End quote. The Soviets were working hard too, and by the 3rd of February, the corridor separating the trapped units from freedom was 80 kilometres wide. The plan was the following, quote, "Momentous decisions have been made. The southern and southeastern sectors would be progressively abandoned. The troops of the eastern sector would then withdraw gradually from east to north. Next, fighting every inch of the way, they would fall back together towards the western end of the pocket, where 11 divisions would gather. German tanks would come up from southwestern Ukraine, outside the pocket, to meet us. Our 11 divisions would rush towards them, risking everything. There was no longer any other way out. Either this desperate attempt would break the encirclement, or we would all die." End quote. Degrelle quickly found himself wounded in the struggle. Quote, "Kneeling in the corner of the Ispa, I shot down every head that showed itself, but my position was too visible. A bullet had wounded me in the finger. Another creased my thigh. Within 10 minutes, a 16-year-old volunteer who had started to shoot beside me took a bullet right in the mouth." End quote. Most of his comrades weren't so lucky. Quote, "My driver, Leopold von Dahle, a hero of the 1914 to 1918 war, rushed into the open terrain, even ahead of the tanks. He was Flemish. A windmill was a familiar sight in his homeland. He was the first to reach one of the black sails and mow down 3 Stalinists with his submachine gun. But a Mongol, hiding close to a buttress at the bottom of the trench, took aim at him, his gun raised. The bullet slammed into him under the jaw and came out at the top of his skull. Incredibly, he still found the strength to reach into his pocket, and like the confirmed Christian he was, grab his rosary. Then he fell dead, his blue eyes wide open, fixed on the large and powerful mill, so like the old mills on the ramparts of Bruges, in the country of Flanders." End quote. All of these acts of heroism, as incredible as they were, barely made a dent. Quote, "Killing the Soviets didn't do any good. They multiplied like woodlice, kept on coming back endlessly, 10 times, 20 times as numerous as we." End quote. The withdrawal went on and on. However, it had to, or they were all doomed. Quote, "The encircled troops were at the end of their strength. There was no more munitions or food. The men were half dead from fatigue. How much longer could we check the thrust of an enemy who knew we were on our knees? Would the tanks from the west muster up enough strength to break through the encirclement and through the incredible mud?" End quote. A secret communication from the staff office of the division to the Walloon Brigade commander gave only 4 to 5% chance of escaping total annihilation. The situation was so desperate that the date for the breakout was moved up. On the 12th of February, the encircled army would attempt its last hurrah, a mad thrust to the southwest. The troops just had to stay put until then. Quote, "It was an endless wait. Almost all the lines were frayed and broken. Could we manage to hold out for 9 hours more, as ordered? Wouldn't our whole bridgehead suddenly crack and fall back in a terrible annihilation? End quote. They truly would get only one shot. Quote, in the beginning, the pocket was as big as Belgium. Now it was smaller than a French department. End quote. The escape was nothing less than a miracle, albeit a bloody one. Degrelle himself was injured when a Soviet tanks attacked the Walloon position, and he was hit by a gigantic piece of rubble, which stuck into his stomach. His legs, he notes, still worked, and so on he went. Meanwhile, all around him as men were being mown down at extremely close quarters. The Soviet tanks were even crushing Walloons under their treads. The commander of the Walloons, Lieutenant Colonel Lucien Lippert, fell on the 13th. Degrelle described him as a true Christian knight who lived only for his Catholic faith. He, like the resolute 29-year-old that he was, led his men from the front. It was as he led by example, crossing a dangerous area towards a house, that he lost his life. Quote, Lucien Lippert rushed forward and made it to the door. At that second he gave a terrifying scream, heard everywhere, the superhuman scream of a man whose life is suddenly torn from him. His chest, ravaged by the enormous hole of an explosive bullet, Lucien Lippert fell to his knees like a stone. He placed his hand across his forehead. He still had the extraordinary lucidity to pick up his kepi from the ground and put it back on his head, so as to die fittingly. The Isper, near where he had succumbed, was defended furiously until our tearful soldiers had finished burying him inside. The enemy retook the area, but the Wallonian Legion didn't want to leave its dead commander in the hands of the communists. During the night, Lieutenant Tyson, his arm shot through by a bullet on February the 6th and streaming with pus, crawled along with the volunteers, rushed the enemy, recaptured the Isper, dug up the corpse and brought it back, through machine gun fire, to our positions. We laid him between some boards. We decided to make a breakthrough carrying his corpse with us. If we didn't make it, faithful to his memory, we would die with his coffin, end quote. And so they were going to push through, with Degrelle now at the helm, for Lucien. The escape was horrifying in the extreme. Dozens of pages of Degrelle's memoirs are purely dedicated to the last few days in which it took place. A familiar theme, however, was the Soviets catching up with them, each time with the same result for those who were too slow. Quote, gasping, our lungs bursting, we couldn't go on. Right under my eyes, the Soviet tank drove down upon the carts of wounded, dumped them over, and flattened them. Horrifying screams resounded, the cries of the dying and the indescribable shrieks of crushed horses, feverishly shaking their hooves. We collapsed at the end of the forest, half dead. Behind us, the grey snow was littered with corpses. The tank, the hordes of Cossacks, charging all around it, was finishing its mad joust, end quote. With what men remained in the area, Degrelle himself took charge, and he got a young German officer who knew French to translate for him. He gave a speech to the men to prepare them for their one last push. Quote, I formed combat groups of 10 men, with a Walloon in each to serve me as a messenger. I requisitioned the weapons, munitions and Panzerfausts of all those who were no longer capable of fighting, and I quickly posted the Germans and Walloons on the rim of the forest. Degrelle had learned Ukraine like the back of his hand by now. Hour after hour had been spent poring over maps for years now, and this was to be Degrelle's crowning moment. It all had come down to this. There was but 3 kilometres now between the relief force and Degrelle's forces. Degrelle, however, was unable to control everyone. Mostly only his own men listened to him. His strategy was to wait until nightfall. Everyone is had to employ patience. For many Germans, however, the allure of their freedom, being just around the corner, was too much. Quote, a grand and terrifying shout resounded, gripping us right to the marrow. Hurrah, Germania, they shouted, rushing forward at breakneck speed. We watched the carnage from the sidelines. Not one man, not a single one, got through. The enemy's tanks poured a withering fire into them. The wretched fell in clusters in the snow. It was a massacre, end quote. Most of the clusters of men ended up horribly lost, and many drowned in river crossings. Degrelle's group, however, pushed on, and they made it. Quote, 2 kilometres farther on, guided by our scouts, we used a trail, marked with stakes, that crossed the marshes on a long, circuitous route. Even there we walked knee-deep in mud. Not a Russian had seen us. We climbed down a snowy slope. On the other side, an army of water shone in the moonlight. We crossed it one by one on a huge slippery beam. After another 50 metres, we had a heart-stopping shock. 3 steel-helmeted shadows surged up in front of us. We fell into one another's arms, laughing, crying, dancing for joy, as all our worry and pain fell from our shoulders. It was the last German post in the south. We were no longer hunted prey. We were no longer living under a stay of execution. The pocket was now nothing more than a horrible dream. Saved. Yes, saved. We were saved. End quote. Degrelle's men had made it out just in the nick of time. There was no medicine left, no food, nothing. They had escaped the jaws of death, right at the last second. The pain wasn't over, however, and this experience would haunt these men for the rest of their lives. Quote, every so often, someone would jump up yelling, babbling nonsense, pummeling the air. In the months that followed, I myself would have horrible nightmares every night, crying out, striking the wall, the furniture, everything near me with my fists in the darkness. During the 3 weeks of encirclement, I had personally engaged in 17 hand-to-hand combats. For a long time, in my tormented nights, I would see again the grimacing faces of Tartars, of Kyrgyz, of Samoyeds, of strange Mongols against whom I had fought for my life almost every day. Even now I am seized with a sort of dizziness when I think of those days of horror. The mocking grins, the leaping bodies, and the rat-a-tat-tat of my hot machine gun." End quote. All in all, 8,000 men had fallen in the course of the breakthrough, but 40,000 had been saved. Those who had taken the heaviest losses were shock units like the SS Assault Brigade Wallonia and the SS Viking Division. When the Walloons arrived at the Dnieper in November 1943, they had 2,000 men. When they left the pocket on the 18th of February, there was 632 of them. Once again, the Walloons had been decimated and had been the hardest hit unit of all, percentage-wise. As the units were being reformed after the chaos, an army corps general ran up to Degrelle. Quote, "Come, the Fuhrer has telephoned 3 times. He is waiting for you. We've been looking for you everywhere for 2 days." End quote. Soon enough there was a reconnaissance plane landing for Degrelle. His men then pushed him inside, and off he went to meet the Fuhrer. Firstly, however, Degrelle met with Himmler, where he was freshened up and prepared for the meeting, and then the Reichsfuhrer SS personally drove him the 40 kilometers from his camp to Hitler's command post in East Prussia. After waiting for a while outside Hitler's office, the man himself appeared. Quote, "The double doors opened. I hadn't time to look at, or to think of anything. The Fuhrer came towards me, took my right hand in both of his hands, and grasped it affectionately. Magnesium lights lit the room. Movie cameras were filming the meeting. I myself saw nothing but Hitler's eyes. I felt nothing but his 2 hands pressing mine. I heard only his voice, a bit rough, welcoming me, repeating to me, 'I've been very worried about you.'" End quote. After talking for a little while, Degrelle was awarded the Knight's Cross. Quote, "But what exalted me above all on this night of great emotion was the prestige that my soldiers had gained in the eyes of the Fuhrer. He told me that all my officers of the pocket were promoted 1 grade, and that he was awarding 150 Iron Crosses to my comrades." End quote. After the meeting, one of Hitler's planes took Degrelle to Berlin, where he spoke with an assembly of European journalists who were to report on the exploits of the Wallonian Assault Brigade. Then it was off to Paris, where Degrelle spoke with 10,000 people, including many members of the French collaboration government. The relationship between Degrelle and the French, no matter what his memoirs say, was bad. Degrelle dreamed of an obscure Burgundian state, somehow fitting into the new European order, which was the topic of his speech. The French, of course, found this idea both laughably bizarre and also hostile to French interests, as Burgundy would mostly comprise of French lands. On the 2nd of April, 1944, the newly reinforced Walloon volunteers marched into Belgium in a 17-kilometre-long armoured column. Degrelle would call this the high point of his career. A few thousand Belgians lined the route, and a few thousand more met them in Brussels. Quote, "My tank stopped in front of the columns of the Bourse. I lifted all my excited children into the tank. I felt their little hot hands in mine. I watched this wonderful celebration, the communion of my soldiers, and this people so sensitive to glory." New tanks rumbled without cease onto the flower-covered roadway. The Anglo-American tanks went into Brussels by exactly the same route 5 months later. End quote. Degrelle had made quite the name for himself all across Europe now, yet behind the scenes, however, it appears that things were not so rosy. Himmler essentially saw Degrelle as an easy weapon to use against the Wehrmacht, and he had no interest in actually entertaining any of Degrelle's bizarre ideas regarding the post-war world. He planned to give him perhaps a small political office, nothing more. For now, Degrelle would be used as a propaganda piece, and a very effective one at that. Still, to this day, Degrelle is the very face of the Foreign SS. Very few people know who Gottlob Berger is, the actual father of the Foreign SS. Degrelle became, and remained, the poster boy, and there was no close second. Raeder and the army, however, continued to see Degrelle differently than the popular image. He was viewed as a man full of childish fantasy, to use Raeder's words. When Rex initially became a force in Belgium, as noted earlier, Degrelle essentially lost his mind, and became utterly lost in his own ego, and his pride. Now, the same was the case, but on a larger scale. Degrelle had seemingly lost his mind completely. Despite all evidence to the contrary, Degrelle genuinely believed that the Germans would give him Burgundy as his own state after the war, and he thought he would be one of the 3 major leaders of National Socialism. Firstly, there would of course be Hitler, but then, in Degrelle's mind, based on whatever he had heard from Himmler or other sources, there would be someone in the Slavic countries, and then Degrelle himself, in the West. Degrelle also tried to extend his powers into Flanders and France, but was utterly rebuffed. The Flemish did not trust him at all, and the French obviously didn't want to give him a gigantic chunk of their country to what they saw as some obscure, failed politician. The Walloon Legion itself was now in a shaky state. It had been completely rebuilt after its heroics at Chicassie, and now stood at 3,000 members. The issue was, however, that most of these men came from POW camps, and they just didn't want to be captives anymore. 78% of them, in fact, it was reported, didn't believe in Rexism or National Socialism. They just wanted food, money for their families, and freedom. The real trouble, however, was at home. Degrelle, feeling himself invincible, had made a lot of enemies, and was emboldened to act up on old grudges. The resistance in Belgium was heating up. Between late May and the start of July in 1944, 37 people had been killed by the resistance. Once the Allies landed on D-Day, however, they too were emboldened. By the end of July, the number was up to 78. Belgium was approaching civil war. Rexist militias would roam around with impunity, essentially shooting anyone they deemed as dangerous, and this resulted in a vicious cycle for them. Degrelle, during his leave, was off enjoying the high life, flings with random women and dinner parties that came with his new fame. Meanwhile, on the streets, his men were out of control. If Rexists could prove that they had killed an enemy of the state, then they'd get a medal for it. This was not very well thought through, however, as in many cases, these enemies of the state were literally just normal, innocent people. On the 8th of July, the resistance, and essentially the people of Belgium by this point, took their revenge. Edouard Degrelle, Léon's brother, was shot inside of his pharmacy shop. Edouard was completely apolitical, and his only crime was being related to his brother, but he was an easy target, and so the resistance took him out. All hell broke loose. At Degrelle's urging, the authorities arrested 46 people, seemingly at random. The Rexist militia didn't see this as enough and began to massacre anyone they deemed a partisan. This included women and also, in some very rare cases, children. Degrelle did nothing to stop this, and he was about to take it a step further. The people who were held captive were left to rot, and 4 of them were put on a list to be killed. All 4 were all political rivals of Degrelle's who had done nothing wrong. On the 14th of July, Degrelle sent a message to Himmler and demanded the execution of more than 100 captives. Himmler did not reply, yet Degrelle went ahead anyway. 3 of the 4 political rivals were shot by the SS. All of them had absolutely no relation to the resistance in the slightest. Between the 12th of July and the 4th of August, a ton more people were killed by the Rexist militias. One of them was the mayor of Wever. These murders, of course, resulted in blowback, and the resistance were doing their fair share of killing too. The cycle continued, and soon enough, Rexist militiamen were scouring Charleroi, searching for literally anyone they could lock up, and a few houses were even torched seemingly at random. A chapel went up in the flames too. Over 20 people were taken by the Rexists, mostly at random, and were dragged to a town outside of Charleroi. At the break of dawn, a Rexist veteran gave the command to kill the prisoners. Almost all of these people, as noted, were completely innocent. One of them was a priest named Pierre Harmiges. The Rexist party, named after Christus Rex, Christ the King, were now, for the second time, tormenting a priest. This time, they'd killed him. His last words were, quote, "I die, and we all die, for that peace reigns in the world, and the men love one another," end quote. This was essentially the last big act for Rex. The Germans were pulling back, and the Rexists with them. Belgium was about to fall to the Allies, and Degrelle's world was collapsing around him. Or at least, in reality it was, even if not in his mind. As the withdrawal took place, Degrelle wrote to the deputy party leader, Mathies, and asked him to take care of his wife and kids whilst he went to the front. Mathies, who had been running the party essentially alone, saw reality and quit the party. For the record, Mathies was present and the one who gave the order to massacre the priest and the other innocents. Leadership was then given to a man named Louis Collard, who was an erratic drug addict with a taste for young women. He was also present at the massacre and prone to violent outbursts, not the best man for the job. 5,000 Wallonian citizens fled east with the Germans, amongst them the Degrelle family, as noted. Now, back in Belgium, the resistance wrought a bloody revenge, and an orgy of killing and looting broke out, which as it turned out, would last for years. The Allies and the police not only did not intervene, but they also sometimes helped. Meanwhile, Degrelle was at the front, as he would say in his memoirs, but this was not the case. He was on a tour of Europe as the poster boy for foreign legions, trying to recruit more youngsters to throw at the already clearly lost cause. Then Degrelle, against Hitler's personal orders, headed to join some of his Walloons who had been carted off to the front in Estonia with next to no training. Degrelle had been forbidden to go to the front as he was needed for propaganda purposes, and despite being told that this would be a court-martial offence, he went. Here the Axis forces suffered greatly. Quote, "Of my 4 new officers from Bad Tolls, 3 were killed and the 4th gravely wounded. In the Waffen-SS, the average life of an officer at the front was 3 months." End quote. The Soviet tide, for a long time now, had been unstoppable. Besides Hitler's superweapons, which weren't yet ready, there simply was no regular means of winning the war. All that mattered was buying time. The position in Estonia was untenable, however, and soon enough there was a mass retreat. Quote, "Behind us the spectacle was heart-rending. The whole of Estonia was fleeing panic-stricken before the Reds. Not a soul stayed in his hut. These people had known the Soviets, not those of 1918, but the so-called civilized, improved and democratized Soviets of 1940. They retained a terrible fear of them. This general panic taught us more than all the political speeches. It was not only the bourgeois who were bolting, but tens of thousands of workers, handymen, small farmers, and sawyers, fleeing the pine groves. The women would exhaust themselves on the roads, dragging along a pig and 2 or 3 sheep. The poor beast's feet would be bleeding. One girl was pushing a pig in front of her like a wheelbarrow, holding it by its rear feet. The animals were all just jumbled together, howling. Many died. It was extremely hot. The old women were dead tired. Suddenly, the Soviet fighter planes arrived, pounced on the columns of civilians, and machine-gunned them savagely amidst the horrified cries of the women and children, and the sharp neighing of the horses, their bellies shot full of holes, that had fallen among the broken wheels of the hay wagons." End quote. And later, quote, "A country was dying. The marvellous August nights were besmirched with the great red torches of villages on fire. Cows, pigs, chickens and geese, all were abandoned on the farms and in the pastures. Not a living soul stirred. Everyone preferred the exodus and machine gun fire to Soviet enslavement." End quote. The scene, Degrelle said over and over again, broke his heart. The Germans did all they could for these people. It is impossible to deny that treatment of the Ukrainians and others was often abysmal. The Balts had once been the serfs of the German lords, but now they were brothers until the end in the same struggle. Hundreds of thousands of those innocent Estonians, and Latvians especially, but also Lithuanians, were evacuated from the Baltic ports, or overland back to the Reich along with the German troops. After the war, they would languish in refugee camps until countries like the US and Australia took them in. But regardless, the Germans had saved thousands upon thousands of lives. Degrelle and his Walloons tried their best to buy time for the ever-loyal Estonians to escape. Quote, "Morale was very high. I decorated our most valorous wounded, right on the ground where they fell. Being hit by explosive bullets that blasted frightful holes in them still did not prevent them from joking and drawing on the cigarette that their buddies put between their lips, outlined in red blood. These boys were unbeatable. Wherever they were placed, the Soviets stopped. I was deeply moved before their simple and smiling bravery. For if their remarks were funny, it was out of modesty, to make fun of themselves at the very moment they were rising to pure heroism. The communists had to be stopped. They stopped them. They didn't let them by on August the 21st. They didn't let them by on August the 22nd, either. When our soldiers were relieved on August the 22nd at noon, the Reds hadn't been able to gain 10 metres of ground north of Kamja." End quote. Soon enough, the Soviets were bearing down on Tallinn itself. Quote, "The roadside, strewn with ammunition bags, bundles, zinc pans, tubs, dead sheep, bird cages. Through this jumble, the haggard human river, civilians, soldiers, Estonians, flowed, screaming towards Tallinn." End quote. And quote, "I had no one left but the walking wounded and the office personnel. We rushed along to Maria Magdalena, along beautiful blue lakes sparkling with all the fires of the summer, insensible to the rout spreading alongside it. I wanted only volunteers. All our brave old comrades of the administrative services came forward. For that matter, what use was there for administration at the moment? The accountants closed their ledgers. Legionnaires, more than 60 years old, who had been cutting sausages and counting loaves of bread since 1941, left their cleavers and their books to take up Panzerfausts. Their quiet courage brought tears to my eyes. All our wounded, who still could walk, lined up in front of the rectory. Of the only 2 officers left to me, one had his arm shot through by a bullet, the other had been hit by a grenade in the chest, but both stepped to the first row of this heroic little troop." End quote. Of the 260 men Degrelle had led when he first arrived at Estonia, only 32 now remained. In the end, Tallinn held long enough for the Germans to evacuate, slowly and at their leisure, all of the troops and heavy weapons down to Germany and Lithuania via the Baltic coast. At the end of the fight, General Steiner, later of Berlin fame, said in a speech, quote, "A Walloon is worth 1,000 other soldiers." End quote. Degrelle himself called this overstated in his memoirs. However, Steiner had bestowed 200 Iron Crosses upon these Walloons, and if they hadn't been ardent Rexists or National Socialists before, they were certainly willing to lay down their lives for Europe against the communists. Quote, "Our soldiers went back down towards Tallinn. The newspapers of Estonia were full of their exploits. They were loaded down with bottles of champagne, which they happily drank as they sailed back to the Reich." End quote. After his Estonian heroics, Degrelle met Hitler for the last time, where he was given one of the highest orders in Germany, the Oak Leaves, as well as the Gold Close Combat Badge, the highest infantry honour which was given to holders of 50 hand-to-hand combat accreditations. The most popular quote to come out of this meeting is the one where Hitler supposedly said, according to Degrelle, quote, "If I had a son, I would want him to be like you." End quote. This quote has forever been attached to Degrelle's story ever since, and in previous videos I myself have repeated it. Upon further investigation, however, it seems extremely unlikely that Hitler actually said this. Degrelle's translator recalls nothing of the sort, and there has been other instances where Degrelle seemingly invents things out of thin air. At best, it's advisable to take this quote with a grain of salt. Back in Germany, later that year, Degrelle was approached by a high official from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who looked absolutely radiant. Quote, "You don't know, we're right in the middle of an offensive." End quote. Degrelle asked, quote, "Offensive? What offensive?" End quote. The official replied, quote, "Why, at your home, in Belgium. Our troops are already in the middle of the Ardennes." End quote. And so, off Degrelle went. He was ordered by Himmler to leave for Belgium with his division at that very instant, which was completely against the Walloon Agreement in signing up in the first place. They were only to fight in the east, not the west. This would be treason of the highest order, but he quickly learned his new orders, and now he wanted to be the first man in Brussels once it fell. Quote, It was officially forbidden to send us into combat on our own territory. We were going in to avoid the errors of the German occupation of 1940 to 44. Flemings and Walloons would have the task of organising Belgium, end quote. There was more to this than Degrelle lets off in his memoirs. Earlier in December 1944, the Germans, after Belgium had already fallen, had decided on the future of Degrelle's homeland. Belgium would be annexed. Flanders and Wallonia would each be their own Gaus. Degrelle would now be Volksführer of Wallonia, and a Freedom Committee for Wallonia was set up with their headquarters close to the Belgian border. Degrelle wrote down a document planning the future for his realm. He wrote that the Belgian people now no longer existed, and that Belgium was now formally split into two and a part of Germany. At the last moment, however, Degrelle did get cold feet. He resisted total annexation, at least for a time. The man who had opportunistically declared the Wallonians to be Germanic against all logic was now staring the consequences of this decision in the face, as the Germans sought to create a greater pan-Germanic state. In the notes written down by the German High Command on the topic of annexation, Degrelle's name appears nowhere to be found, whereas his Flemish counterparts was included. Now that the writing was on the wall, however, he accepted his new role as a Gauleiter, a far cry from what his men sarcastically called him behind his back. Modest, I, King of Burgundy. Degrelle rushed along to Sepp Dietrich's command post to follow the Axis advance into Belgium. It all seemed so much like 1940 at first. Quote, "We were at the match as excited as spectators. We passed through our two Ardennais villages with their white arms, one whose walls, Rex, could still be read in tall letters, painted in the vibrant days of our great political combats. We went down as far as the village of Steinbach, a few kilometres to the northeast of Houffalize. An ancient castle was there, frigid and deserted, at which we halted our little column. The Ardennes farmers came out of their houses and welcomed us with a touching simplicity. Everyone remembered grandparents who had lived in this region, or recalled the meetings I had given. They took us to eat in their low-roofed farms lit by ancient gas lamps. Potatoes fried in lard were steaming on pretty flowered plates, as at the meals of our childhood. These hard and noble faces, shaped by the work of the fields, were the beloved faces of our own people. We breathed freely, our spirits radiant. In the warm farms full of shadows, near the wood fire, crackling around the andirons, we surrendered ourselves to the sweetness of having found our land again, and our people again." End quote. The dream, however, quickly turned into a nightmare. The attack stalled, and the Allied bombers came, flattening the Walloons' beloved homeland, as well as their families and friends. Quote, "Their bombs turned the ravishing town into a monstrous heap of ruins, with mounds of dead civilians beneath them. The Ardennes was flattened in a few days. Not a town on a road to somewhere else, not a crossroads escaped. It was a terrible way to wage war, at the expense of women and children crushed in their cellars. But this means, which the Anglo-Americans used without any restraint, quickly proved to be decisive. At the end of a week, all roads used by the columns of the Reich had become almost impassable." End quote. Degrelle himself, once again, almost became a casualty. Quote, "I barely had time to behold the marvellous blue, brown and white panorama of the plateau of the Ardennes, halfway between Houffalize and Barak-Freitor, when a low-flying fighter came down on us, charging almost at head height. 2 bullets as big as my thumb passed through the motor. Another slashed my helmet. A fourth punctured my documents, passing exactly between my ribs and my left arm. A truck that we'd met did a crazy pirouette on the bank and turned into a torch. We were able to pull one soldier out of the wreckage more or less whole. The others, crushed under the weight of the car, were burned alive. We could see their fires crackle. For a quarter of an hour, the low flyers kept coming back and forth with ferocious hatred, hitting us with incendiary bombs at point-blank range each time. All along the roads, it was the same hunt of man and vehicle." End quote. Almost as soon as the Ardennes offensive had begun, it was over. Quote, "As for us, it was our native soil that we had to leave. Our country, our people. We couldn't tear ourselves away from this last village. Nevertheless, there was absolutely nothing left for us there to do. All hope of saving the situation was dead. We wandered around the house in the snow to look at the whitening fields, the smoke rising in the distance from the roofs of the little farms, the slate steeple like the blue steeples of our childhood. We had to make the decision. We kissed the good old Ardennes mother who lodged us. It was the last kiss of our country. We went around one more long pink farmhouse and along the black firs. The border was close. Sons of Europe, we were also the sons of our own little fatherland. Our hearts torn. We closed our eyes so as not to see any more." End quote. There was no time to waste, however, and soon enough, Degrelle and his Walloons were sent to the east to halt the Soviet tide in Pomerania. In the Baltic states, there had been hundreds of thousands of desperate civilians fleeing for their lives. Now, in Germany, there were millions. It was hell on earth, and the Germans, Walloons, Frenchmen, Scandinavians, Latvians, and all the others somehow had to fight against an enemy multiple times as numerous as they were. It was an impossible task, like all the others over the past couple years. On the 30th of March, Rex was officially disbanded. On the 19th of April, Degrelle was told about the disaster that was befalling Berlin, and he drove to the capital to evacuate his Walloons who were stuck there. On the 29th, Degrelle met Thomas Müller, the commander of the Flemish troops fighting in Berlin. Degrelle told him that he wanted to meet Himmler to try to produce a solution for the Berlin situation. He heard Himmler was in the north, and so off he went, eventually arriving at Lübeck. It was here that he heard of the Führer's death. Then he was off to Kalkhorst, where Himmler would be arriving. Degrelle seemingly by now realised that a very unhappy ending might be a possibility, and he asked about getting a plane or submarine to bring him to Sweden or Portugal. He also, strangely, wanted to change his name to Leon Shakassi. On top of this, he demanded that the Germans fund his parents who were currently in Hanover. Only a few days later did Degrelle finally bump into Himmler. Degrelle viewed Himmler as the new Führer, but the reality couldn't have been more different. Here, Himmler promoted Degrelle to SS Brigade Führer and General Major of the SS. This didn't make any sense, however, as Hitler had already fired Himmler from his post as SS leader a week prior, so this is either a Degrelle invention, or Himmler refused to accept that he was no longer in his former role. Himmler advised Degrelle to get to Denmark as Dr. Best, the German governor there, was friendly with the former SS leader. Himmler, displaying emotion for once in his life, supposedly said, quote, "You have been among the faithful, you and your Walloons. You were the last to stay by our side through the fighting and misfortune. One day, Germany will remember," end quote. And then he set off, but not before rolling down his window and saying, quote, "Degrelle, you will be needed one day. Everything will change quickly. Gain yourself 6 months. You must live," end quote. And then he was gone. An hour later, the two caught up again as Degrelle caught up with his entourage. But then, that was it. The two men would never meet again, and Himmler would soon be dead. Degrelle's life, however, would pan out rather differently. Soon enough, Leon and his staff were in Denmark, and here he found some of his men. Quote, "A group of Walloon soldiers who had come by sea were already in Copenhagen. We met one another with great shouts of joy," end quote. The current plan was this. Quote, "We had an understanding with General Pank, the SS commander in Denmark, that as our men arrived they would be sent to Norway, where we would regroup and face events. There, the last anti-communist front was to be found. The 300,000 German soldiers who were massed there were well armed and supplied. They would be able to fight for a long time. Their surrender would be the last and would probably have the benefit of better conditions. I fixed all the details for the transfer of my men. It was understood that the departure of the Walloons for Oslo would begin the next day," end quote. This was pure fantasy, however. The German forces in Denmark surrendered unconditionally, and this left the foreign volunteers in a precarious situation. Partisans were patrolling the streets with machine guns. Suddenly, however, a blue limo appeared and told Degrelle and his staff to get in. They had to put on civilian clothes and leave their weapons behind. This was it, their only way out. Dr. Best had done his very best to get Degrelle out. The limo went from checkpoint to checkpoint, speeding or bluffing their way through, dodging partisans at every turn. Quote, "Our driver, unflappable, drove straight in, made a dazzling turn, scaled a concrete tank trap, and exited the lair with a perfect ease. We passed near the delirious crowd and headed into the neighbouring lanes at full throttle," end quote. Quote, "It was then that my former good luck once more ruled my destiny. Heavy machine gun fire had broken out just that minute. The Danish communists had tried to seize the harbour petroleum depot a few hundred metres away. The Germans had violently resisted with all the weapons at their disposal, including anti-aircraft guns. There was a desperate scramble. Civilians, terrorists and partisan sentinels fled, rushing into the houses. God's second, our automobile raced forwards, crossed the 30 or 40 metres of narrow bridge like an arrow, made a wide curve, came down again, and stopped in front of the gate. We were saved. We were at the entrance to the harbour," end quote. Before Degrelle's eyes, however, a British transport plane landed nearby. The net was closing, and the German fleet, with 20,000 men on board, had no plans to set off for Norway. The commander, however, had other ideas for Degrelle, and he turned to a young commander of a minesweeper and said, quote, No, it will not be said that Germany abandoned you. You're going to break a passage through. I want you to get to Oslo with Degrelle," end quote. Just in the nick of time, they set off. At 10 a.m. on the 7th of May, Degrelle arrived in Oslo. Here, Leon met Dr. Terboven, the German governor of Norway. Degrelle told him about the plan to hold firm in Norway, but the doctor could only shake his head. He spoke of exile in Sweden and Japan for Degrelle, not a last stand in Narvik. Afterwards, Degrelle was invited to meet with the Norwegian Prime Minister, Vidkun Quisling. Quote, "Quisling seemed crushed by fate. We made small talk for half an hour. Tobovin had asked me to calm him, which eliminated most subjects of our conversation. He gave the impression of being devoured from within. His face was puffy, his eyes wandered in every direction, his fingers tapped the table. The man felt lost. I was his last visitor. That afternoon he hurried to the Swedish border, was turned back, and returned to Oslo that night, no longer knowing into which fjord to throw himself. He was shot a few months later." End quote. It was here that Degrelle heard the total German capitulation on the radio. Quote, "The troops of the Reich in Scandinavia were treated correctly, repatriated and liberated. The German forces in Crete even obtained the honours of war. They went back to their country armed. But for us, the last foreign volunteers, it was the abyss." End quote. Late that evening, Dr. Tobovin met with Degrelle. Quote, "I have asked Sweden to give you asylum. She has refused. A submarine could perhaps have taken you as far as Japan, but the capitulation is absolute. Submarines can no longer leave. At the airport at the foot of the mountain, there is still a private plane. It belongs to Minister Speer. Do you want to take your chances and try to reach Spain tonight?" End quote. Degrelle accepted the kind offer, no matter the risks. At 11 p.m. that evening, a pilot arrived at Degrelle's hotel wearing his German cross in gold. Degrelle and his last officer then got in. Soon enough, they were in the sky. The journey was hectic. The radio crackled and voices appeared asking who they were and what they were doing, and searchlights lit up the sky. Soon enough, Degrelle could see Belgium below him. Quote, the wretchedness of being beaten and seeing one stream die. I gritted my teeth to keep from shedding tears. It was in the night and the wind, pursued by a bitter fate, that I had my last rendezvous with the sky of my homeland." End quote. Soon enough, the Pyrenees were visible. The fuel gauge showed 0, and the engines kept misfiring. It seemed almost certain that they wouldn't make it, despite being ever so close to their goal. Quote, "The plane wanted no more of it and had to come down almost to water level. We were going to die, 20 kilometers from the Iberian coast. We had to shoot the red shipwreck flares. 2 military patrol boats headed towards us, coming from the French coast. What a tragedy, and to think that a searchlight was now blinking in the distance, a Spanish searchlight. It was strange to see the white-capped crests of the waves, and the sea lapping up close beneath us, ready to swallow us up. We still hadn't fallen in. The coast was coming closer, pushing its reefs and rocks toward us, and its green and black peaks, barely detached from the shadows. Suddenly, the pilot stood the plane up vertically, almost turning it completely over, and revving the motor so as to catch the last drops of petrol. Then, he charged over a rocky hill, and with an awful racket, grazed several red roofs. We no longer had the time to think. We had seen a short ribbon of sand in a clearing. The Heinkel, which hadn't lowered its landing gear, slid on its fuselage at 250 kilometers an hour. I saw the right motor explode, glowing like a ball of fire. The machine turned, lunged towards the sea, went into the waves, and crashed. The water flooded into the back cabin and rose up to our waists. I had 5 fractures. On the beach at San Sebastian, the civil guards with black 2-cornered hats rushed back and forth in agitation. Some Spaniards, as naked as Tahitians, swam out to our wretched plane. They pulled us up onto a wing of the 2-engine, then into a launch. An ambulance vessel came alongside. This time, the war was really over. We were alive. God had saved us." End quote. Degrelle and his officer, Robert de Vels, survived the crash. However, one of the German crew members was not so lucky. Degrelle was quickly taken to the General Moeller Hospital, and he put his survival down to divine providence and the protection of Saint Michael the Archangel. Jose Luis Jerez Riesco writes in his book Leon Degrelle in Exile, quote, "As hard as it may seem, the crash landing was actually a stroke of luck. If Leon Degrelle had been uninjured during the crash, it is possible that the Spanish authorities, in order to avoid complications in those crucial moments, might have asked him to leave Spain immediately. Leon Degrelle was totally immobilized by his multiple fractures and severe trauma, and this is what saved him. His short-term misfortune was really a long-term blessing." End quote. Initially, the issue was seen as a Belgian-Spanish issue, not a broader one, at least on paper. Therefore, the Belgian authorities couldn't get to Degrelle, and so they took out their anger on others, namely the Degrelle family. Degrelle wrote in a letter to a friend during his time in hospital, quote, "As for my family, I live in terrible anguish. You know that 2 days after my crash here, Hayul de Termecourt committed the shameful act in his spite of having my old father and old mother arrested and imprisoned. They are 78 years old with 28 grandchildren. Dad has grown quite old and is no longer in a position to dress himself. As for my mother, as you know, her evangelical sweetness, well, she has been dying of heart disease as of last February. She is kept alive only by injections. I cannot think, without bursting into tears, of the crucifixion that these poor people are going through. According to what I have read in a small French newspaper from the Pyrenees region, everyone in the Degrelle family, including my poor Janae Rati, whose state of health, you know well, and her 2 daughters, has been detained. 2 little girls. I wonder how far this shamefulness will go." End quote. In the end, both of his parents died in prison. His wife served 6 years. His children were all locked up, too, making his youngest daughter, at 8 months old, the youngest girl ever to be imprisoned. Degrelle never found out the whereabouts of his children for 14 long years. The rest of the family was locked up as well. One of his sisters served 2 whole years, and his brother-in-law was butchered during his stint in prison, and the prison guards refused to answer the calls for help from his neighbouring cellmates. It was a terrible time to be a Degrelle. Even Degrelle's birthplace wasn't spared. It was razed to the ground, and a courthouse was built on top. A Belgian representative and the Spanish undersecretary did indeed meet to discuss Degrelle, but one of the Spanish conditions was that he not be considered a war criminal, and that his extradition not in any way lead to his execution, which was quite the sticking point for the Belgians, who were baying for his blood. Belgium then tried to bar Spain from joining the UN in an attempt to make them play ball with Degrelle, yet Franco-Spain stood firm, at least for a time. As it turned out, Degrelle was originally meant to return on the same plane as Pierre Laval later on. Degrelle's doctor, however, point-blank refused to allow him to get into the van that was designated to take him there. He said that Degrelle either wouldn't survive or would be murdered on the way. As it turned out, as soon as Laval was back in France, the French went back on their agreement with the Spanish, and the former Vichy leader was swiftly put to death. Degrelle had escaped death thanks to his doctor, and the Allied betrayal of their Spanish deal with Laval only improved Léon's position. It should also be noted that Degrelle wasn't the only Belgian in Spain at that moment. René Legros, a leading Flemish collaborator, was in Barcelona, and the Allies wanted his head too. He, like Degrelle, had already been sentenced to death in absentia by a court composed of many communists. Luckily for Legros, however, his case was simpler. With the help of the monks at the monastery of Montserrat, he was able to slip out of the hands of the Spanish authorities and escape to South America, where he was to live in exile until returning to Belgium in the 60s. Meanwhile, as for Degrelle, in July 1945, there was already an attempt by the Belgian authorities, in league with Basque communists, to kidnap him and bring him to the border. The Belgians had reached out to the hospital staff and attempted to bribe them to turn a blind eye to the disappearance of their patient, but luckily for Degrelle, the Spaniards had no intention of screwing him over, and the authorities were informed, and the plan was foiled. In January 1946, there was another attempt, but far better planned. The Belgian Prime Minister had personally approved a plan for Colonel Lovenfoss, Belgium's most decorated resistant, to go and kidnap Degrelle. Spaniards had been paid off to the tune of nothing less than a fortune. Degrelle was to be transferred to another hospital, only for the van to break down, whereupon the Belgian agents, along with their French allies, who had already pre-arranged absolutely everything down to the tiniest detail, were to snatch up Léon and take him to Belgium to be executed. The plan was leaked, and Lovenfoss himself would later publish all the relevant documents. In 1976, 30 years later, Degrelle sent a postcard of his face to Lovenfoss, with the following written on it, quote, "To my dear and glorious friend adversary, Colonel Georges de Lovenfoss, who so magnificently honoured our country, with the friendly talent of a frontline fighter, who, too, fought passionately for his homeland. Kind greetings from Léon Degrelle," end quote. Lovenfoss, too, was full of forgiveness. He would write in his memoirs 6 years later, quote, "I realised that Degrelle had not committed any crimes, and that I would never again do an operation like that. We must leave Degrelle in peace," end quote. He would also publicly talk in support of Degrelle and reaffirm his stance over and over again. Degrelle had done no wrong and must be left alone, he said. He also praised Degrelle's valour and courage, quote, "30 years later, I am happy that the mission failed," end quote. Degrelle had the same effect on the first interviewer who was allowed to come and see him in hospital. He had served as a captain during the Second World War, and yet after the interview he was seen pacing up and down, shaking his head and stated, quote, "What a pity that Degrelle did not fight on our side," end quote. To this interviewer, Degrelle handed a signed proposal which was titled, "I offer my head," exclaims SS officer Léon Degrelle, "statements to our special envoy on the last moments of Nazi Germany," and it laid out the basic conditions for his voluntary surrender. 1. Total amnesty to his soldiers and officers of the Eastern Front. Degrelle said that he alone assumed full responsibility for their perceived errors. 2. An impartial hearing with Allied observers and with the radio and press in attendance so that the whole country could fairly hear the trial. And lastly, quote, "Finally, a soldier's request. I ask to appear and die, if necessary, wearing my glorious uniform with the Belgian insignia with which I fought on the front and wearing my decorations won in combat. My soldiers died like this. I want to fight and fall exactly as they did," end quote. Needless to say, the Belgian government, with a gigantic proportion of communists and socialists in it, had no intention of taking Degrelle up on these terms. As for the interviewer, 36 years later, Degrelle sent him a postcard too. Quote, "To my dear and admirable friend on the other bank, Robert Francot, in memory, unforgettable memory, of his visit to me in the military hospital of San Sebastian, where I discovered the generosity of his heart. With faithful affection, Leon Degrelle." End quote. By mid-1946, Degrelle had been in Spain for an entire year, and this entire time, negotiations had fruitlessly been going on behind the scenes between the Belgian and Spanish governments. The Belgians refused to budge on any of their terms, yet the pressure from the Americans and the English on top of the Belgian crusade for Degrelle's head was overwhelming. There was talk of just capitulating. Once this news reached Degrelle, his Spanish friends quickly began to plan for his escape. The nuns of the hospital, especially, arranged things for him to be able to make a quick getaway. One sister, named Isabel, had left the window to the street open night after night, just in case. Working with the sister was a former Blue Division officer who waited under the window for Degrelle every single night, just 50 meters away in a parked car. Degrelle didn't know anything about this until the officer came into the hospital and told him. Leon said, quote, "I do not want to get a Spanish soldier shot who would be fulfilling his duty by detaining me. Moreover, they can leave all the doors open that they want, because I am not ready to leave. To flee would mean that I am running from a fighting court, an admission that I am guilty of the filth that they accuse me of. I will not leave." End quote. Despite these brave words, however, Degrelle had indeed been considering the possibility of fleeing to Ireland or a South American country. A former captain of the Nazi intelligence services had even come to Degrelle, disguised as a priest, to discuss such an escape. Eventually, Degrelle did take up one of these offers to escape. The escape included none other than the Generalissimo of Spain, Francisco Franco. In August 1946, in view of the untenable and implacable situation and the pressure of all kinds exerted at the international level, the Spanish authorities granted Leon Degrelle 8 days to leave Spanish territory. This was more of a simulation. Franco worked, in this case, in a Gallego way, so his resolution was ambiguous. Well, Degrelle will be officially expelled, but not actually expelled. They decided to stage a guarded escort and expulsion from Spanish territory along the Portuguese border with a Leon Degrelle double. Thus, the requirements and formalities would be technically fulfilled. Ramon Serrano Suna, the pro-Nazi former foreign minister and Franco's son-in-law, was part of the escape. Quote, "It would not have been easy at that time without Franco's quiet approval. Everything was prepared in agreement with him." End quote. The plan went off without a hitch. It didn't take much to get any Spaniard needed on board with the plan, and Degrelle had won himself friends seemingly everywhere already. The well-orchestrated plan was pulled off shortly after Degrelle was served his expulsion papers. The guard conveniently got a phone call, and then suddenly Degrelle fled to a waiting car out of a side exit, leaving Degrelle number 2, the body double, to leave in front of the waiting journalists and board a train in the direction of the Portuguese border. Meanwhile at El Pardo, Franco's palace, the Generalissimo had met with a group of the conspirators, and he had personally helped get a new fake passport set up for a Mr. Enrique Durand, a merchant born in Warsaw, Poland. Generously, Franco also arranged for 20,000 pesetas of his own money to be sent to the penniless Degrelle. And so, off went Mr. Durand to live his new life in Madrid in a safe house provided by a Serrano Suna, with these defiant words, quote, "I do not go to the slaughterhouse. I do not give myself up. I am not going to Portugal, because there President Salazar will have the same problems, the same difficulties as General Franco, and furthermore, the Portuguese police will turn me over. I stay here, even if I am thrown into the road, or in a ditch. I will hide as I can, but I will stay here." End quote. The hospital, however, was probably better than his new accommodation. He wrote, quote, "I lived in the maid's room. No light, no ventilation. The man in the house weighed about 130 kilos. It was unbelievably hot, even during the middle of the night. I remember going to bed every night with a large chamber pot. I produced 4 litres every night." End quote. For the next year and a half, Degrelle would not leave that room. He never saw the sky of Madrid, trapped between those 4 narrow walls in that tiny room, with the only source of light being his bedside lamp. Here, however, he wrote and wrote and wrote. It was also here that he learned, via the Madrid daily newspaper, of the tragic death of his parents in the Belgian jail where they had been thrown away and forgotten. He wrote in a letter which was to be secretly given to his sister regarding their mother's death, quote, "What a pain, what a heartbreaking pain this new misfortune. Mother is dead. I find myself here in my black hole, shedding all my tears. She has died without me being able to give her my love for the last time. She has died, overwhelmed by all the evils my life has brought upon those who loved me. Ah, what a torment it is to think about this terrible blow that father's latest arrest brought to mother, guilty only of having given me life. To have loved my parents so much, and finally to see it come to this, that mother died because of me, that father suffers cruelly because of me, nothing can quiet my grief. I feel like I will carry this burden in my heart until death." End quote. It was a rough year and a half for Degrelle. As noted, he had no idea where his children or his wife were either. He was almost utterly alone. Only a tiny handful of people, including Franco, knew of his new identity or where he was. Meanwhile, the Allies searched desperately in Portugal for Degrelle, who according to the Spanish news had already been deported there. All the vessels leaving Portuguese harbours were searched, the countryside was combed, and the border was scanned. There was no sign of him. Leon Degrelle had slipped their grasp. The Spaniards, meanwhile, wiped their hands of the matter, much to the annoyance of the English ambassador. Quote, "Far from having left Spain, he's either escaped or has been hidden by some friends. If he has really left the country, it is absurd that they give us no details. They instead refuse to give further explanations in this regard, unless they are personally corroborated by the foreign minister himself." End quote. The American ambassador even turned up and rudely demanded an explanation from Franco. Franco simply replied, quote, "If you want to see the reports, they happen to be here, on my desk." End quote. On his desk was a complete dossier detailing the deportation of Leon Degrelle to Portugal in excruciating detail, even including when he went to the toilet and when he ate. It was so unbelievably detailed that it just had to be real in the Americans' eyes. The meeting went off without a hitch. Meanwhile, Mr. Durand, the Polish merchant, was just a few miles away in a dingy attic. The Belgian government, however, didn't buy it, and they continued to make Degrelle their top priority and denounced Spain at every turn. Whilst the world was up in arms about his whereabouts, Degrelle, or rather Enrique, got his first work permit on the 21st of November 1947 as an art expert for the Enrique Durand Company with a salary of 12,000 pesetas a year. The death of Degrelle's mother had been a big enough of a blow whilst he sat in that attic room, utterly devoid of any sunlight or human interaction. When the news came regarding his father, however, he broke. Degrelle was so depressed that the scar from one of his wartime injuries opened from his neck to his stomach. He had dropped 77 pounds. He was plagued by endless hemorrhages. The news, or rather the lack of it, regarding his children was eating him alive. He could take it no longer. He had to at least break out of this confinement and feel the sunshine. He got in touch with his Falangist contacts, one of whom was Jose Antonio's cousin, and sought assistance with getting down to the sunny Malaga coast. This was easily enough arranged, and soon enough, he was there, at a small fishing port, where he could at least eat and sleep for 30 pesetas a day. He would recall, quote, "I was there for 2 months, ready to die, just going swimming in the evenings." End quote. One day, in September 1948, a man appeared to greet Degrelle, who turned out to be none other than Jose Antonio Girón de Velasco, the Minister of Labour. Degrelle had been recognised by a local German, and it was he who had informed the Falangist Minister of Labour. Upon seeing Degrelle's condition, Jose swiftly had him taken to an expert Falangist surgeon in Madrid who saw to his needs. Clearly it worked wonders, as Degrelle was later often heard to say, quote, "Girón saved my life." End quote. In early 1949, Degrelle headed south and met with Robert Duwels, his faithful Wallonian companion from the flight. Here, Robert had been able to lead a decent life with his family. Degrelle was welcomed in with open arms and loved Robert's children deeply and treated them as his own. Leon could not stay in such an obvious location forever, of course, and soon enough a more long-term location was found for him by his Spanish contacts. It was a farmhouse in Majalima, Laura del Rio, that Degrelle would spend the next 5.5 years of his life in, finally able to relax and recover from his laundry list of injuries in the healthy mountain air. This was Degrelle's new dawn, and he truly turned a corner in his life. Never again would he reach such lows as he reached in those first few years in Spain. During Degrelle's time in Majalima, 20 kilometres from the nearest village, with only an old crank-up telephone connecting him to the outside world, he began to write like a madman. Books began to appear all over Europe, authored by poorly disguised pseudonyms. His works consisted of mainly the history of the war years in Belgium, or at the front, most prominently his still in-print work, The Eastern Front. Degrelle, by now, was an avid poet, and had been ever since his arrival in Spain when he discovered his long-lost love for that art. In January 1951, Leon Degrelle finally broke his silence, and he gave an exclusive interview to the magazine Europe America from Brussels. Here he set out to defend all of his wartime actions, and revealed what was in his eyes the sly and devious attitude of the Belgian government. This was the first time Degrelle had properly spoken to his people, his Walloons, since the war. The publication absolutely flew off the shelves, and tens of thousands of copies were sold. Degrelle then had another interview with the United Press, and he expanded on the same topics. A few months later, Degrelle would set out on the Way of St. James pilgrimage, which leads to the Shrine of the Apostle James in Galicia. Clearly, by now, Degrelle wasn't so worried about being extradited. He went alone, taking only a small backpack. It was a truly incredible feat in itself, and it does appear as if Degrelle became far more pious in his exile. Quote, "The pilgrimage to St. James truly satisfied everything, the mystical first, with all of its proliferation of miracles, churches, works of art, transforming the spiritual into the real. The epic, with the immense legend of Charlemagne connecting with the wonderful divine being, planting in him his mighty deeds all along the way, and the spirit of chivalry, not only for this fact, but for all those carried out by European knights on their way to Compostela, who, preceded by a herald, would hold tournaments along the entire route." End quote. In total, by journey's end, he had traversed 1,000 kilometers on foot from his starting point in the Pyrenees. Upon arrival, after bowing at the Apostle's tomb, he joyfully wrote in his diary, quote, "All of my being sings the joy of having overcome, of having been able to arrive, of having lived a few weeks of spiritual elevation, of having collected beautiful things." End quote. Whilst Degrelle was barely even attempting to hide his whereabouts and was being recognised everywhere, the Allied authorities heard and believed rumours that he was here, there, and everywhere, from Uruguay to Portugal. None of these rumours, of course, were true. In 1952, Degrelle had his famous poetry book, The Burning Souls, published on a limited, collectible scale, with each unit bearing a Roman numeral on it. In 1954, the second edition was published, which was smaller in size and flew off the shelves, selling thousands of copies and quickly selling out completely. The poetry was about exactly what the title suggests. For example, quote, "Human beings have barricaded themselves behind their selfishness and pleasure. Virtue has abandoned its natural song. Happiness has become, for man and for woman, a heap of fruit which they devour in a hurry. Happiness only exists in the gift, the complete gift. His selflessness gives him the flavour of eternity." End quote. And later in the book, quote, "The money, the honours, the mess of bodies, the eagerness to seize an earthly happiness, which leaks between the fingers and always escapes, has made of the human herd a pitiful horde, ruining itself, tearing itself apart to find a liberation which does not exist. This baseness has poured out from the limited circles of the elites into the extended circles of the masses, tossing them about on waves of infinite desire, ambition, and pseudo-pleasures, which are just caricatures of joy. There is great hatred between men, between classes, between peoples. Everyone is bent on the pursuit of material goods, which ultimately avail nothing. All abandon the goods, proffered to all, of the moral universe and the eternity of the soul." End quote. The reconquest. The world is more and more preoccupied with banal, material, or simply animal joys. It maintains itself only by the principle of maximizing material wealth. Each man lives only for himself and allows the domination of life both within his own home and within the country through a constant egoism, which has converted men into hateful, embittered, greedy wolves, or corrupt and soulless half-men. We will come out of this downfall only through an immense moral recovery, by reteaching men to love, to sacrifice themselves, to live, to struggle, and to die for a higher ideal. The time is coming when saving the world will require this handful of heroes and saints to make the great reconquest." End quote. Riesco writes in his book on Degrelle's exile, quote, "It was in Seville that he carried out his first dealings and commercial transactions that offered him a livelihood. He then helped to set up a metallurgical industry near Guadalajara. He also executed some excellent deals in Australia related to cotton. Later, in 1952, he became a builder to help provide shelter for 50 families on an American base. Leon lived his life in exile with maximum dignity, thanks to the work he was doing. He was not concerned about money." End quote. This is the first time in Jose Luis's work that he mentions Degrelle's way of making a living, and it's far from clear how Degrelle ended up getting into such international business endeavours. Degrelle also purchased a vineyard called La Carlina in the early 1950s as well. On top of this, Degrelle worked in construction and he had houses built that would later house US troops who were stationed nearby at the base that was set up in 1953. Whilst Degrelle got on with what was seemingly a semi-high profile, affluent life in Andalusia, the foreign press still, somehow seemingly couldn't find the man. Locally he was known as Don Juan de la Carlina, or one of his other fake names, but he was often recognised, and it was essentially an open secret. It surely must have got out of the general area, as he'd been recognised on his pilgrimages too. Despite this, a French newspaper wrote an article in the 1950s reporting that Degrelle was in Brazil and that he had a new wife with whom he had just had a mulatto child with. Meanwhile, Degrelle's actual wife had finally been released from prison in September 1950, as the Belgian government had a new, softened policy of reducing the sentences of minor collaborators. She also got custody of her children back after what must have been a painful half-decade. Marie Paul appears to have come to visit her husband, albeit just for a few days, in 1951. In autumn 1954, she came for another short stay. Riesco writes, quote, "To avoid the grave dangers and problems that were continually surrounding him, Leon and his wife extinguished their joint partnership and opted for free, voluntary, and spontaneous separation." End quote. That same year, Degrelle gave an interview to a Phalangist magazine in which he said, quote, "The greatness of the virtues tempered in pain and sacrifice was never in vain, which is worth more than hatred or death. Sooner or later, they will shine, just as the sun that arises from the depths of night. In the future, rehabilitation will not suffice. Men will only bow to the heroism of the soldiers of the Eastern Front of the Second World War. They will also say that they were in the right, that they were really in the right. Negatively, since Bolshevism represents the end of any value. Positively, because the united Europe for which they fought was the only, perhaps the last, chance of survival for a wonderful old continent." End quote. Degrelle, much like Mosley and others believed, thought that Europe should unite in some form or another. In the interview, he touched on the topic, quote, "Yes, let us add Christian Europe. The time of nationalism has passed. As in the Renaissance, it passed from the province to the nation. The love of the homeland will be preserved, increased even, by joining it to a great common spiritual mission. But the normal and human union of Europe will be achieved. If we want to survive, we need to do so without hindrance. The current mistake lies in wanting to build that unity on economic material and materialistic interests." End quote. In December 1954, Spanish press agencies reported that Leon Degrelle had attended a ceremony in Madrid in honor of veterans of the Spanish Blue Division who had served on the Eastern Front. This turned out to be true, and it was his first public appearance since he left the General Moeller Hospital in 1946. A few days earlier, he had also been officially adopted by an old woman in his village, so he could obtain Spanish citizenship, since he was currently, officially, stateless. This, predictably, caused an absolute media firestorm, but the Spanish just denied that Degrelle even attended the event, despite photographs showing the opposite. Shortly afterwards, Degrelle had an interview with the United Press Agency to discuss the drama. The interviewer asked, "What about war crimes?" To which Degrelle replied, quote, "I have not committed any war crimes. Never. Nowhere. To keep saying that I have committed them, as is still being done, is a horrible slander. Never has a court condemned me, nor tried me for a war crime, whatever it may have been. I was sentenced to death in absentia on December 27th, 1944, as a political leader and as a volunteer on the anti-Soviet front, and for nothing else. They need to be logical here. A few years ago, Spanish General Munoz Grandes was received in Washington and at the Pentagon with great honours. He was my colleague on the Eastern Front and commanded a division exactly like mine. He has now been awarded by the United States. How can they claim that, for the exact same action, I should continue to be persecuted savagely?" End quote. There was also a notable local event around this time. Some of Constantina's citizens came to pay a visit to Degrelle. They had a present for him. One of them, a little boy named Pierre, bought Degrelle, who was so generous in their village, a dog named Dogo, who was trained as a good companion and a vigilant watchdog. Degrelle immediately took a liking to the dog, and the two deeply loved each other. Almost as soon as the friendship began, however, the dog was tragically hit by a car and killed. Pierre, too, was devastated. Degrelle, thinking of the boy's grief with his own children in mind, wrote a poem about their lost friend to cheer him up. This was just some of the very long work. For reference, Pierre's nickname was Pichu. Quote, "Dogo always wore a collar of wild forest flowers, fiery flowers of a light violet, or white flowers with a gold heart, or a bunch of margaritas. This was rather ridiculous, as dogs should not be given flower ornaments. But Pichu, it was necessary to challenge ridicule. For those who mock are generally more ridiculous than those who are not afraid to defend what is beautiful. Dogo was beautiful with the flowers around his neck, like a conqueror or a poet. He came back later frolicking, passing in front of the other dogs, and his flowers stood out against his black hair. The other dogs, who donned no flowers, looked envious of our Dogo, a poet who donned the flowers of great forests, where he, the seeker of chimeras, had found his chimeras, the pretty rabbits with tails of white pomp." End quote. It ended, quote, "Always remember this lesson from Dogo, Pierre. Later, like him, like me, force people, even if they do not want it, to rise above their laziness and mediocre situations. Make them fly, even if you have to bark very loud behind the partridges, so that they can be the birds upon the earth, or beings with the soul in the undergrowth of men." End quote. In 1957, Degrelle was visited by Jean-Pierre Debaut, a sort of protege of his. Here, Degrelle opened up about his exile. Quote, "It is not exile that makes me suffer, it is the inactivity. It is feeling immense dreams deep inside that cannot be fulfilled, and also the idea that they have made noble, righteous, generous human beings who imagine monstrous things about me, who have been able for 10 years to listen to all the infamies they have poured on me. It is easy to insult someone defeated, someone who is prohibited from responding, someone who cannot talk or explain himself. I have offered it 10 times. Obviously, what they want is for me to return there, but not to let me speak, so that they can kill me." End quote. During these almost 13 long years, Degrelle still had no word about his children. He entrusted Debaut with a 15-minute tape and asked him to show it to his now grown-up children back in Belgium, which he did. His only son, Leon Marie, aged 18, immediately decided that he had to come and see his father after listening to the tape. He dismissed anyone, including his mother, who offered him advice to the contrary. In October, suddenly, Leon Marie turned up at his father's door, to Leon's absolute joy and amazement. The boy moved to Seville right away, and began taking Spanish lessons. Each weekend was now reserved for father and son alone. They had a lot of catching up to do. Degrelle's life had changed forever. It was the happiest he had ever been. But then, just as had happened with his dear dog Dogo, tragedy struck. On Saturday, February the 26th, 1958, Leon Marie died in a traffic accident. He was riding a Vespa motorcycle he'd been given by his father. In fact, he was on his way to his father's house when he was struck by a taxi. His neck and cervical vertebrae were immediately broken, and he was put into an irreversible coma. He didn't even have the time to realise what was going on. The local phalangists recognised the boy, despite him having no identification on him, and they rushed him to the head of the local phalange, where a priest gave him extreme unction. The young man was dead before his father could even get to him. Degrelle had had his world made, only for it to be so brutally ripped away a few months later. It was the hardest blow he had ever been dealt by far. Debeau, who was whipping up a political storm back in Belgium, wrote a moving article in his magazine and finished it, quote, "Yes, Leon Marie is present with our young heroes of the Eastern Front, the Abrassards, the Taverns, and also our martyrs, fallen on the interior front. May Leon Degrelle, our chief, our friend, if by chance these lines get to him, in whichever part of the world, let him know that we share his grief and affliction in the painful ordeal that he has suffered again today. If it will lessen his sorrow, let him also know that, as always, we are all unconditionally at his side." End quote. Degrelle's wife blamed her husband for the event. She wrote a letter to Leon's sister, a nun, quote, "I blame him for having taken away my son, and I hold him responsible for his death." End quote. She then used this as a pretext for an official divorce. Degrelle was clearly distraught, but wrote that he was resigned to the situation, and asked only that she let him see the children and keep the matter discreet. He finished the letter, quote, "Apart from this, I can only wish for peace and sweetness to the one who is leaving. I feel pity for her. If it were possible, I would prefer to be left out of all these procedures, which, as a Christian, are reprehensible to me." End quote. In the end, friendly priests intervened and prevented the divorce from being recognised in the canonical legal sense, but the two remained separated. Anne, Leon's daughter, felt a deep sadness for her father's sake during the whole ordeal, and she chose to come and visit him. She too ended up staying, and lived in his house until she married a young phalangist attorney. Soon enough, 2 more daughters arrived, and decided to permanently live in Spain as well. The eldest, Chantal, began travelling frequently to Spain to visit her father too. Leon may have lost his son, but now he had the rest of his children. Meanwhile, behind the scenes there was another kidnapping attempt. This time the culprit was Belgian judge Albert Mallet, the very same man who had approved the persecution of the entire Degrelle family. He was the very man who was responsible for the cruel death of Leon's parents and of throwing his children into foster care, forced to grow up without their parents. He had been a member of the resistance during the war and had committed numerous acts of terrorism, which earned him quite the name for himself in the post-war regime. Malot got a private plane to Sevilla and had a 10-man commando group made up of former communists ready to help him. He turned up at the property when Degrelle wasn't there and tricked the gardener by pretending to be part of the Rexist faithful. He then studied the building from the inside in detail, photographing as he went. He even attended mass with Degrelle, sitting just a few pews behind him. Once everything was prepared, Malot went to meet the secretary of the Belgian embassy in Madrid and got him up to speed, telling him that it would take place imminently. This information was sent back to Belgium, where it was decided that such a mission would be imprudent, as Degrelle could bring all sorts of information to light about Belgian politicians, which would cause absolute chaos. Information was rushed back to Malot, and he was told to call the whole thing off immediately. Malot remarked later, quote, "I was quite surprised to be told that the Belgian government did not wish to see Degrelle returned." End quote. In March 1959, Senator Moulin of Belgium remarked in a speech in Parliament that Degrelle, quote, "was an untouchable man." End quote. The Belgian government wanted legal extradition so they could quickly take him and kill him. If there was any big drama, or if he were allowed to talk, then it would mean political disaster. In 1961, the greatest attempt to kidnap Degrelle so far was discovered. It was none other than the Zionist Secret Service, Mossad. The Israelis believed that they could simply waltz into Spanish territory and kidnap a Spanish citizen, much as they had done to Eichmann in Argentina. This time, however, the government was no pushover. The West German government learned of this illegal plot and immediately informed the Spanish security services, who took the threat extremely seriously. Horia Sima, the leader of the Romanian Iron Guard in exile, also found out about the plot and informed Degrelle. It was as if the Jews weren't even trying to hide it. Degrelle was quickly taken to Madrid, where he lived in a small apartment for several months, guarded by 5 police inspectors, who never, ever left his side. In fact, they even slept across the floor of the small apartment, so they would never lose sight of him. This situation was so claustrophobic for Degrelle that he remarked to his protector, Carlos Navarro, quote, "I preferred to be killed by my enemies than guarded by my friends." End quote. Whether Leon liked it or not, however, his friends were saving his life. 3 months passed, and it was clear, or at least it seemed clear, that the plan had been foiled. Immediately upon Degrelle's return home on the 30th of June, however, he discovered that the electric lighting around the house had been disconnected, and that the dogs on every single neighbouring estate had been poisoned and killed. Degrelle wrote to a friend, quote, "The plot in question. It is not safe. If these individuals truly want to achieve their goal, they will achieve it. They have powerful means, and I cannot keep ceaselessly annoying the government here. Furthermore, you know this country. Strict measures are quickly relaxed, and my abduction is just a kid's game. Simply put, all I can tell you is that if the operation is carried out one day, they will not find me alive." On the other hand, am I still alive? Everything has died around me. Great ideas and great dreams. The years pass, and with them the golden years of strength and faith. Everything is frayed, and is breaking down. I am like the dead man who has been left with his eyes open in the coffin. From time to time, a hopeful breeze blows in, refreshes the atmosphere, and puts me into action. But our time now is no more than jumping from miscarriage to miscarriage, like a woman who can give no more of herself. The great masses are brutalized by the enormous forces of the beasts and the corruption that dominates everything. How do you blow all this up? I would certainly jump for joy if there were still a possibility of rebuilding a great Europe, but my hamstrings would be numb before the chance to jump ever came. If this possibility can still be given to a world that does not deserve it. In short, Michelangelo used mud, not to honour clay, but to create beauty, and the eternal man is made of mud that can serve the worst today, or the best if the time of destiny comes again." End quote. The recipient of this letter, Francois Janot, had overheard a group of Jews in a Swiss restaurant discussing their plans for Degrelle. The man dominating the conversation was V. Helbert Alboudi Cedevans, formerly Dubensky, the Deputy Director General for Security in Israel. Here he spoke about how the capture and harsh torture of Leon Degrelle would lead to all sorts of important information. Most important in their list of goals was the location of Martin Bormann, who was of course already dead, but the Jews refused to believe this. The plan was to simply overpower Degrelle and drag him to a ship in a Mediterranean port. Upon hearing this, Janot rushed to the airport and took the first plane to Madrid. The Jewish team arrived in Spain armed with sophisticated and deadly weapons as well as gigantic funding. The American magazine, Look, which was massively funded by Jewish capital, had already paid $100,000 for the exclusive. Other sources racked up millions, if not tens of millions of dollars to be put towards this mission. The Israelis were out for blood. The Jews, however, had been far too bold, far too prideful. They thought they were above the law, even untouchable. This simply would not fly in Spain. At a customs booth, a civil guard immediately spotted the forged US passport and had the car searched. Quote, "During the registered search between the roof and the upholstery, they found an arsenal of pistols, 3 submachine guns, very strong nylon strings, steel shackles, bottles of chloroform and narcotics, a map of Andalusia with a target on the town of Constantina, and even a detailed plan of Degrelle's house." End quote. Alboudi was then interrogated and immediately broke, confessing everything on the spot, and began to have a mental breakdown. He named all of his accomplices, and even gave every single detail of the plan, including the getaway ship. Oddly, in Alboudi's luggage, the civil guards found 3 pairs of ladies' underwear. 6 million pesetas were also seized, which were to be used to fund the operation and to pay off communist accomplices in Sevilla and around Constantina. Alboudi and one of his accomplices, who also got caught, named Feinson, were found guilty by the Spaniards and sentenced to 6 and 9 years in prison respectively. After a few years, however, international pressure and friends in high places managed to secure the criminals' freedom. Feinson in 1963 and Alboudi in 1965. Part of their release terms was that they never speak to each other again, which they obviously broke almost immediately afterwards, as they collaborated on a book together named The Avengers, which was published in 1968. This wasn't the only Jewish plot that decade. On another occasion, a new Jewish expedition set off from Antwerp, but suddenly, a Jewish lady showed up at Degrelle's sister's house. Quote, "Madame, I have finally been able to find your address. Your brother Leon saved my life during the war. I would like to thank you for that. He is going to be kidnapped in Spain, and I have come to warn you. The team will disembark in Bilbao." End quote. The ship carrying the attackers was apprehended immediately when they docked, and they were all arrested. In 1962, Degrelle was offered safety at the house of an American colonel. One night, Degrelle and a colonel were awoken by frantic barks from the huge guard dog. A man was seen hiding right next to the bedroom window, and another was scaling the fence next to the colonel's tennis court. The American then began firing his weapons wildly at these kidnappers, but didn't hit anything. For the 3rd time in just 2 years, Leon Degrelle had cheated death. It was, however, time to move on. In 1963, Degrelle moved to his new destination of Terra Blanca de Sol in Malaga. Here he would remain for the next 25 years in a single house known as La Cabana, or cottage in English. Notable visitors included none other than the last Führer of Germany, Admiral Karl Dönitz, as well as Otto Skorzeny and the well-known French film star Alain Delon, who met Degrelle in Spain during the filming of the smash hit movie Zorro. An infamous photo was taken of the two of them, and it quickly spread around the world. Leon commented, quote, "Delon comes to visit me. Sometimes I receive him at home, and other times he invites me to the set to watch the scenes that he is playing in. Does this mean that he is a Rexist? Certainly not, but he is one of the characters who arouses the passions of those who have nothing to do with the battles of the Forum." End quote. In the same year that Degrelle moved into his new abode, he also visited and stayed at the monastery of the Holy Cross of the Valley of the Fallen. The Valley of the Fallen itself, a commemoration to those who fell on both sides during the Spanish Civil War, had only been completed a few years prior. Here, Degrelle would stand in front of the tomb of his fallen friend, Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera. Riesco writes, quote, "He spent several days in meditation and prayer, leading a contemplative life, serene, austere, monastic, occupying a cell and attending all the religious services, and prayers dictated by the monastic rule. He took part in the Eucharist. He wrote pages of meditation on his faith. He kept a private diary, where he reflected upon the singing and psalmody in voice, without musical accompaniment, which formed solemn Gregorian chant. He found a relief from his fatigue, and struggled in the oasis of his deep and sincere religiosity. Living next to the tomb that houses the mortal remains of his admired comrade, Jose Antonio, the founding initiator of the Spanish Phalange." End quote. From then on, whenever Leon visited Madrid, he would go to the Valley of the Fallen to pay his respects to all who had fallen, but more specifically to Jose Antonio, and then, later, Francisco Franco too. Meanwhile, back in Belgium, 20 years had passed since Degrelle had been sentenced to death in absentia. Legally, this should have meant that Leon could return home, and indeed, this was what the former Rexist leader wanted so desperately. To avoid this, the Belgian government cobbled together a law known as the Lex Degrelliana, which added a 10-year extension. This was bizarre and completely unheard of, but regardless, bizarre or not, it was put together purely for Degrelle. During the debate that took place on this topic in Parliament, 3 women in the gallery shot to their feet and shouted loudly, "It is time for Degrelle to return," which caused a huge stir. The 3 women were quickly booted out of the premises on the orders of Chairman Van Acker. One of the women was given 15 days in solitary confinement for that one sentence. The law was passed by 148 to 5. In July 1965, and what was now becoming a familiar trend, there was yet another kidnapping attempt, this time masterminded by none other than General Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle detested Minister Spaak of Belgium. The two disagreed totally on their future vision of Europe, and de Gaulle knew full well how much information Degrelle had on the man. He thought that by dragging Degrelle before a fair court, like Degrelle had been begging for, he could get the former Rexist leader to sing like a canary about his enemy, Spaak. When in Madrid, Degrelle stayed at an extremely discreet apartment, yet someone, one of the few who knew, betrayed Degrelle's whereabouts in Judas fashion for his 2,000 pesetas. The plan was ready for late July. Degrelle, however, felt something gnawing at him. He felt uneasy, like death was just around the corner. For this reason, he decided to change the flight to Barcelona to a closer date. The kidnappers turned up at his door less than half an hour after his departure. In this way, Leon Degrelle, once again, cheated death. Later on, when asked about how he always seemed to escape the endless kidnapping attempts, he said, quote, "For very simple reasons. Firstly, because I am lucky, always protected by a special baraka. Secondly, to kidnap me, they have to resolutely risk their necks. I was not an easy man to catch. I got my training during 75 close combat engagements on the Eastern Front. The kidnappers, even knowing that, always acted within the shelter of protective operations that were too complicated. It was evident that they did not want to die in their attempt. In the end, those gangsters, in the service of certain low-level politicians, and even the naive Lovenfoss, wanted nothing more than my blood. Lacking a great ideal, they did not know how or want to risk anything of themselves, and so they failed outright. I could always face them because I have what they do not have, faith in a cause. I sympathise with those whose lives are only shadows without light. I prefer to be on top and not on swampy ground." End quote. In January 1970, Degrelle was interviewed by ABC. The interviewer asked Degrelle how he spends his days, to which Leon responded, quote, "I get up very early, at about 6 a.m, and I immediately write. Then I attend to my business, and soon I am back to reading. I read at least 1 book a day, and publishing my work. From time to time, I talk with friends. I like to be open to the opinions of others. In the evening, I read until quite late. I despise the need to sleep. It is a humiliation, and I do not usually grant this requirement any more than 3 hours a day." End quote. Degrelle was drawing far too much attention to himself. Spain was desperately trying to get into the European community. Belgium, once again, used Degrelle's extradition as a bargaining chip, and he certainly wasn't helping himself, as he seemed to be doing interview after interview, many of which were incredibly provocative. The Spanish government was far from the one that was there when Degrelle arrived too. He was even summoned by the government so that they could formally request that he leave Spanish soil within 48 hours, yet Degrelle simply did not turn up to the appointment, and he went underground, especially in February of 1970. A year later, he still had to be on his guard. Degrelle wrote to a friend named Blas Pinar in April 1971, quote, Dear Don Blas, this is your friend Leon. My situation remains difficult, with diabolical rage they continue to pursue me, despite my absolute silence. We know from an indisputable source that only in the course of last week, the Belgian embassy in Madrid sent 3 encrypted teletexts about me, proof that they're preparing something again. See you soon, dear Don Blas, with brotherly embrace." End quote. Seemingly, he was somehow able to worm his way out of this latest crisis, and in 1973 he was back to appearing in controversial interviews. That year he was interviewed by Dutch TV station Avro. Only 20 minutes of the hour and a half recorded was actually broadcast, however. People in Belgium were able to tune in, and once again Degrelle was drawing up a crisis for himself. Leon openly stated that fascism was good, that he himself wanted to begin to struggle to achieve a fascist Europe, and he defended the ideal of a greater or united Europe. He said that he had no regrets and was proud of everything he did, especially what he called his personal friendship with the Führer. Immediately after the interview aired, the Belgian government asked the Spanish authorities to prohibit Degrelle from speaking about politics. Seemingly, they weren't so keen on his deportation at that time for some reason. His German comrades clearly felt the same way as Degrelle about their wartime exploits. He received a letter in April 1973 from a former surgeon in the Viking Division, which always tended to work closely in tandem with the Walloons. Quote, "Dear Comrade Degrelle, it is a curious thing that leads me to write this letter to you. 3 weeks ago I gave a lecture in Munich before an audience with very diverse political opinions, which dealt with camaraderie and my memories of the war. I spoke, among other things, about the experiences we shared together during the siege of Cherkasy. I was then the Viking Division surgeon, and the hospital was installed in the Korsum school. This is why I've kept a very vivid and accurate memory of the visits you made to the wounded, always accompanied by your driver. These boys were sometimes so seriously injured that they could not even bear being talked to, but when you arrived, those heavily wounded, sleepy and feverish soldiers would suddenly wake up and sit up in their beds, yelling jubilantly and full of joy, 'My commander, my chief.' At that time we had dinner together on several occasions. On one occasion I asked you, considering the impact of our desperate situation, why you did not exert political activity in your country, and why you remained at our side despite the desperate situation we were already in at that time. You answered me, 'We are now at war and I will not return to politics again until this crusade ends.' I remember it like it was yesterday. Shortly before the siege broke, the Führer's order had been received in which he expressed his desire to get you out of the infernal siege by putting a plane at your disposal, as he needed you for other political tasks. You refused the tempting proposal, saying, 'I will stay with my men through the good and the bad.' Indeed, you led your men heroically, breaking through the enemy siege after the death of the commander-in-chief of the besieged forces. This is camaraderie. That was the general theme of the lecture I gave. I have just read in the Weekly Der Spiegel a detailed article on what happened to you afterward, plus it includes your Madrid address. For my part, it only remains for me to tell you that I am a surgeon, and I have a very comfortable economic situation. I would very much like to hear from you, and I affirm my absolute fidelity, just as before. Yours sincerely, J.K." End quote. December 1974, legally, should have been the bounds of the statute of limitations when it came to Degrelle. This was the 20 years, plus the strange 10-year extension. Now, however, 2 months before the expiration, in October, he was banned by the Belgian government on grounds of public order. Degrelle's entry to his own country, quote, "may be denied by order of the Minister of Justice when the presence of a foreigner in Belgium is considered to be liable to compromise public tranquility, public order, or the security of the country." End quote. The Belgian government themselves had stripped Degrelle of his Belgian nationality in 1945. Now he wasn't allowed in because he was classed as a foreigner. A further 10-year extension was also looked at, but a legal commission ruled that the procedure was absolutely illegal, as well as a denial of human rights. All this for a man who was pushing 70. Regardless, he was alive. He wrote in a letter to his daughter, quote, "Yet I, well healed by the sun, happy to be alive, full of good humour, standing next to the tombs of my grave diggers, will I pass by one day on my way back? That is possible. It would be fine, but I am not sure. Why will it really be necessary to die? I have no envy for them. I am full of dynamism. Life is a charm. To be alive, to see the sky bursting with the gold of dawn, alive, to take in big deep breaths of air, to live, to feel the brain turning everything on, creating original, beautiful, great things, to live, to be one of the human stars that God has cast of the most diverse soils through space. It is a spell to live. It is a conquest, a joy every second, like missing a minute of this party, letting it stop a minute too soon." End quote. On the 20th of November, 1975, Francisco Franco, the man Leon had to thank for being alive at that point, passed away. Degrelle knew just how much he owed to the Generalissimo, and fittingly he wrote a 64-page essay titled Homage to the Great Man of Spain, Franco, which was published as an independent book the next year. On the 20th of May 1979, Leon sent a letter to Pope John Paul II, concerning what was then beginning to be called the Holocaust. The letter was indeed officially received and read by His Holiness. The letter was so long that it was even published in book or rather pamphlet form under the title Letter to the Pope, and its publication was quickly extinguished in Belgium. Essentially, the letter was Degrelle claiming that the events that the Pope believed to have taken place did not in fact take place. The letter was because Pope John Paul II had visited Auschwitz. Firstly, he appealed to his Catholic faith. Quote, "I am a Catholic like you, and I believe by this fact that I am authorized to write to you as a brother in the faith." End quote. He then appealed to the Church's historically tedious process of making sure information was absolutely 100% correct. Quote, "The Church is always much better informed than anyone else. Through 2,000 years of circumspection, she has always avoided hasty positions, and has always preferred to judge on proven facts with calm, after time has separated the wheat from the tares, fury and passions. The Church always distinguished herself by extreme restraint throughout the Second World War. She always carefully kept herself from spreading crazy speculations that ran rampant then. Countless lies with increasingly stubborn anger have been repeated in thousands of books. They've been republished in colour, in apocalyptic movies that furiously flog not only the truth and likelihood, but even common sense, the most elementary arithmetic, and even the facts themselves. You, Most Holy Father, were said to have been part of the resistance throughout the Second World War, taking physical risks involved in a fight contrary to international law. Certain people report that you were hospitalised in Auschwitz. Like so many others, you left there, for you are currently the Pope. A Pope who, with all evidence, does not at all smell like the famous Zyklon B gas. Your Holiness, who has lived in these places, should know better than anyone that this massive gassing of millions of people was never a reality." End quote. And so it went on, page after page, in often autistic detail, discussing the size of the rooms, the type of doors, crematorium capabilities, typhus, Allied bombing of camp supplies, and such topics that usually feature prominently when one denies the Holocaust. The letter had a very sarcastic, passive-aggressive, and even outright rude tone, surprising for someone like Degrelle, who claimed to be so Catholic. Safe to say, the Pope did not reply. In February 1980, whilst Degrelle was present, the Spanish authorities bashed down his apartment door in Madrid, took his art that was inside, and seized the apartment. It was never returned. This was the new Spain, no longer Franco's Spain. The following year, Degrelle was back to his controversial interviews. He did an interview with History magazine which was titled "Why I Believed in Hitler." The interviewer, Jean Capelle, asked Leon, quote, "You are the leader of a Belgian nationalist movement that claim to be Catholic. Is there no contradiction with your alignment on the side of Hitler's armies?" End quote. Degrelle responded, quote, "People have lied about Hitler in this regard. He was intensely devout and frequently invoked the name of God. His beliefs were Christian, and even in his childhood he was part of the choir in his parish church. It is true that some National Socialist leaders were hostile to the church, like Bormann and Himmler, not to mention Rosenberg, but their influence on Hitler in this regard was negligible. He did not take Himmler's interest in ancient Germanic religions very seriously, and his policy was very favourable to the Catholic Church, even when opponents of the regime emerged from the church. On one occasion I met him one morning when I was on my way to receive communion, and when I told him my intention, he was not surprised, telling me that his mother, had she been alive, would have joined me. He was very discreet in this regard, but had a true devotion to his mother's memory, and what Kubizek has stated in his memoirs is very revealing. To me, my religion did not seem to be at all in contradiction to my siding with the principles and ideas promoted by Hitler. He understood very well, to the extent that one day he told me, 'If I had a son, I would have liked him to be like you.'" End quote. The following year, Degrelle and the US-based Institute for Historical Review recorded their famous and still much-watched documentary on the Waffen-SS. Degrelle began his monologue by making the point he wanted to stress clear, quote, "In a certain sense it was surprising that this organisation, which was both political and military, and which during the Second World War brought together more than 1 million volunteer combatants, continues to be officially ignored. A very likely answer is the fact that the most salient feature of the Waffen-SS was its composition, made up of volunteers from about 30 countries." End quote. The documentary was typically Degrelle. The SS was portrayed as some kind of Europe builders, in which the diverse peoples of Europe all banded together for a united version of a united Europe in the future. Degrelle himself, of course, had not even wanted this at the time, and he dreamt of his Burgundy vision. The almost 200,000 Latvian and Estonian troops, whether they were conscripts or volunteers, almost to a man, would not have wanted such a vision. It certainly was not as simple as Degrelle was making it out. Regardless, he went over the full history of the SS, albeit in a very biased Degrelle type of way. As a Catholic, Degrelle was unable to divorce, and so, instead, he waited, at least to get remarried that is. Almost as soon as his wife was in the ground, however, he remarried. In January 1948, Marie Paul passed away, and then just a few months later, Degrelle was getting married to Joanna Breve, the niece of Joseph Donat, the commander of the Vichy milice. Both Leon and Marie Paul, as you may remember, had cheated on each other frequently, and so it would be quite a stretch to imagine that either of them had simply waited all these years in chastity during their separation. Joanna's name also would not come up once in any of my sources on the time period before their wedding, strangely enough. In 1986, Leon was sued by Violetta Friedman for denying the Holocaust, and he chose to hold his own. A journalist summarized the results of the trial, in which the names of David Irving and Ernst Zundel were brought up. Quote, "In mid-July 1968, a trial was held in Madrid in which the Venezuelan Jew, Violetta Friedman, accused Leon Degrelle, a Spanish citizen, of having doubted the deaths of Jews in gas chambers. The judge handed down a ruling in favor of Leon Degrelle, in which he expressed the argument that, as a citizen, Degrelle enjoyed the right to freedom of expression and his own judgment." End quote. Throughout this entire last period of Degrelle's life, too, he was endlessly harassed by the ADL and the Simon Wiesenthal Center. The latter constantly made up stories about Degrelle and accused him of being guilty of war crimes. When a journalist went to every individual nation and asked them if Leon Degrelle was wanted for war crimes, all of them, including Belgium, said no. The Wiesenthal Center even put money on Degrelle's head so that he could be arrested and dragged before a court. Degrelle, however, was resigned to his fate by now. He dared them to try, and no one took up the center's offer of blood money. The endless harassment campaign was extremely annoying, however, regardless. Soon enough, Violetta Friedman launched an appeal and called upon left-wingers, Jews, and anyone else on her side of the political spectrum to descend on Madrid for the trial to cause a big scene at the proceedings. This completely backfired, however, as a counter-protest organically sprung up amongst the Spanish youth, who staunchly defended Degrelle and outnumbered the protesters. The court ruled in favor of Leon Degrelle. An international press campaign broke out, calling Friedman a, quote, "victim of anti-Semitism," end quote. But by now, no one cared. Degrelle had achieved total victory. As the years passed, Degrelle began to slow down, at least in public. Behind the scenes, he continued to work feverishly. His magnum opus was supposed to be a great history of the 20th century that would span several extremely thick volumes. There was to be Volume 1, Sarajevo's Trap. Volume 2, The Pseudo-War of Law, 1914 to 1918. The third was The Cheaters of Versailles. Next was to be Democratic Hitler, followed by Hitler, Unifier of Germans, and then Hitler, Builder of the Great Reich. Then, for the last three, there was to be Hitler, Trap at Danzig, Hitler and the Waffen-SS, and then Hitler, Military Genius. If this all sounds rather biased by the title, that's because it was. Publishing house after publishing house, even right-leaning ones, found it impossible to publish such works. In the end, this task proved too much anyway. Degrelle would never finish it. He was already in his 80s. On the occasion of what would have been Adolf Hitler's 100th birthday, on the 20th of April, 1989, Degrelle wrote an article in a fanatically pro-Nazi magazine. Quote, "It has become increasingly clear that the 20th century will be marked by the work that Adolf Hitler has carried out. The greatest political events of our time, the most prodigious military confrontations in our history, bear his signature and have been stamped with his seal, not only for our time, but for eternity. After the disappearance of the ideal of which he was a bearer, the world changed its skin, and above all, its soul. The unconditional idealist was succeeded by simple and foolish materialism. Any fool can become a vibrating fanatic of motorization, a slave disciple of consumerist civilization. The frayed pants of young Europeans or Americans, and even Japanese, are marked with the labels of the Levi-style Jewish tailors. They no longer appreciate the rebirth of spring in the tree leaves and in the fields 100 meters from their homes, but they travel the world without understanding much, with high-tech cameras. The cities have been transformed into huge prisons, with tight housing like cigarette packs. Evenings are nothing more than endless sessions of television applause, featuring annoying jerks or vicious, stupid vampires, showing their breasts like grapefruits, or scandalous epileptics gesticulating in the crossfire of dazzling, multicolored spotlights, decline, decay, baseness. All this because a tremendous genius, who had created a new man, secure and strong, was defeated, slandered, and thrown into the trash as if he was some old and repulsive thing. Here, however, the human being from half a century ago is the same today. He has eyes and ears, but he had one thing that no longer exists today, and which is the only thing that counts: faith. It was a time when millions of wonderful and determined young people, behind big drums and flags, symbols and badges, toured our great avenues and illuminated with their looks, as well as with their torches, the grey streets of our cities. From the depths of nowhere, Hitler raised millions of waves of these young bearers of enthusiasm. They believed. Their songs proclaimed their faith in life. Hitler, a firm and sure soul, made this miracle possible, the greatest of miracles, to make man, who is nothing more than clay to be moulded, as on the first day of creation, a being vivified by spirit." End quote. On the 12th of June, 1989, Degrelle was finally reunited with his comrades. Together, they staged a grand reunion in the Balearic Islands. In attendance were not only his Walloons, but also plenty of his Flemish counterparts. Degrelle wrote afterwards, quote, One more year gone by, yet a year that has been marked for me by an event of the most noble meaning. Indeed, on June the 12th, 1989, after 44 years of separation, I had the overwhelming joy and the Baleares of seeing, for a few hours, a charter plane filled with my comrades, my very dear veteran comrades of the Eastern Front. I will never be alone again, near my birthday, in my distant exile. In the bright moment of their prime, while these magnificent boys lined up at my side on the Eastern Front to participate in the crusade against murderous communism, Anglo-Saxon hyper-capitalists would, from 1941 to 1945, become powerful and imbecilic allies of these same communists. They handed over half of Europe to slavery under the monstrous USSR, which we had tried at that time to defeat. The communists massacred, for more than 70 years, millions of victims, and plunged the economies of 20 nations into total bankruptcy. Now, finally, they began to realize that we were right, that we sacrificed our youth and offered our blood to save Europe from that plague. With Hitler, with Mussolini, with the 600,000 European volunteers of the Eastern Front, we had a gap, but it was 50 years before the dupes would open their eyes, remaining deceived by the Churchills and the Roosevelts. Looking at each of you, looking into your eyes, I find my old brothers. I see again, always shining in each of your eyes, the great ideal that has filled your lives with honour. It was worth it. History is proving you right. Be faithful to your heroic life. Faced with the blind of yesterday and today, be happy that you have consistently accomplished your goal without failure. Hail, my faithful Burgundians. I embrace you all. Leon Degrelle. End quote. Things were coming to an end. He wrote to himself in January 1993, quote, "Behold, 60 years ago, I was then in full action. I have seen fit to gather the first issues of the publications that marked my youth. I looked at them now with emotion. I am reminded that, from the beginning of my career, my life has been an impulse of faith, an explosion of my ideal. I have lived no more than to create greatness, to give the multitudes the means to become ennobled and to overcome. At the end of my life, I have nothing to regret. The same convictions still burn within me. If I were 20 years old again, I would take the same road, however hard it has been. Even if coping with it were 1,000 times more painful, I would climb again the rough ascents to the summits. Believe, fight, conquer or die. That was my life." End quote. The past tense was quite the right one to use. Time was running out. In February of the following year, Degrelle, sensing the end was right around the corner, wrote a farewell message to his comrades. Quote, "My dear ones, my dear comrades, confined in the depths of my exile, I have never been closer to you than on this 50th anniversary of Shikasi. Those days, by dint of courage, renunciation and sacrifice, you delivered the last great victory in the East to the armies of New Europe. Remember with pride, in today's rotten world, only the virtues of heroes still shine. Tomorrow, it will be they, and the heroes now who will be gathered in glory. You are great, and only this counts in life. To you, my dear comrades, with the last beats of my heart, I kiss you. Leon Degrelle, February 18th, 1994." End quote. A week later, he wrote his will while sat facing the Mediterranean Sea. On the 10th of March, 1994, Leon was admitted to the local hospital in Malaga as he was suffering from heart failure. Later that month, on the 31st, at 11:10 p.m, Leon Degrelle gave his soul to God's judgment. A long life of exile would come to an end. Leon Degrelle, the last great name of the Second World War, was dead at the age of 87. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and please do leave a like if you made it this far. If you'd like to support the channel, then feel free to click one of the links in the description to support me on Patreon, Subscribestar, or as a YouTube member. Even the $2 tier helps immensely. Thank you.